Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of What If Hokage Naruto Went Back in Time to Fix His Mistakes. If you enjoy the video, then like, share and subscribe, and also comment your thoughts as it inspires me to make more such videos, and remember to check out my playlist section for other interesting stories. So let's get started. Chapter 4. People take notice. But only Hiashi-san knows. This question was directed at both Sarutobi and Hazashi as Haruki glanced between them, arms crossed. He had been summoned by the Hokage at 6 in the morning and had spent the past 15 minutes being filled in by Sarutobi about yesterday's conversation after he had left. Sarutobi nodded. He has agreed to the plan. We will execute this before telling the council. Haruki nodded and then glanced over his shoulder when a muffled knock sounded. Is that him? I asked him to come. We will need to finalize the plan. Sarutobi raised his voice. Come in. The door opened and Hiashi stepped in. Immediately, Byakugan eyes clashed with cerulean as the clan head studied Haruki with careful intensity. Haruki only stared back impassively, rising slowly to his feet before dipping his head in a sign of respect. Not a full bow though. He didn't care what time he was in, he didn't bow to anyone anymore. Hiashi closed the door behind him and the privacy seal settled again. He nodded a greeting at his brother and bowed slightly to the Hokage, but his gaze was ultimately drawn back to the red-haired Junin standing in the room as he listened to Sarutobi's introduction of this man as Kazama Haruki, the spy that had brought his brother back. There was a puzzling weariness to this man's stance, and Hiashi's eyes lingered on the color of his irises. A distant memory tugged on him, but he couldn't quite place it. A mild frown made its way onto his face. Those eyes reminded him of someone, but it was just out of reach when his mind tried to grasp it. He dismissed the thought, leaving it for another time, and studied the rest of the Junin instead. There was no doubt about it. He had never seen this Kazama Haruki before. There was no way he could have forgotten such bright hair on a Junin or even a Chunin. Hiashi recalled the respectful nod he had received upon his arrival. A nod, not a bow. This man was proud in the quiet sort of way Hiashi approved of most. And instead of looking down while in a clan head's presence, Haruki stared right back, not challenging him, only acknowledging him. So Hiashi returned it. He nodded back, returning the Junin's strong gaze with an equal one of his own. I believe I have you to thank for the safe return of my brother, Kazama-san. I and the Hyuga clan will be forever thankful for what you have done. Haruki blinked once, tilting his head to one side as he tried to adjust to this Hyuga Hiashi. The one in his time, the Hiashi he had gotten used to, had dropped most of this formality, and while his words had still been spoken with all the polite upbringing of nobility, that Hiashi had also been blunter. Haruki could get away with a simple, "You're welcome," to Hiashi's straightforward, "Thank you," and vice versa. Well, he had never learned how to talk like a noble. He wasn't about to start now. You're welcome, Hiashi-san sama. Haruki replied plainly, ignoring the inquiring quirk of one of the noble's eyebrows when Hiashi caught his slip. I was happy to help. Hiashi stared at him for a moment longer before the Hokage coughed quietly, drawing their attention back to Sarutobi. The Hokage said nothing, keeping his expression neutral, but Hazashi's features were edged with faint amusement as their somewhat stilted exchange came to a halt. Now then, Sarutobi said briskly, turning to Haruki first. Your plan is good, but there are a few holes in it. Hiashi-san mentioned earlier, the council will want to know why we did not immediately inform them when you came home with Hazashi-san. Hiashi-san has come up with a solution. Hiashi took his cue and explained, Hazashi is part of the Hyuga clan, and thus he can be considered clan business. Hokage-sama's first action after you relayed the information to him a week ago would be to inform me. As the Hyuga clan head, I can choose to withhold this information from all outsiders and deal with the issue in accordance to my own wishes as long as it will not jeopardize the village. The other clan heads will accept this explanation without question, and the rest of the council knows not to interfere with clan affairs. Haruki stared hard at Hiashi before pointing out flatly, you'll be lying to the council. Hiashi didn't so much as blink. Yes. Haruki observed the calm resolve Hiashi's eyes before shrugging. Sounds good to me. But, he turned to take in all three of the room's other occupants as he continued. Danzo won't fall for it. He may not challenge it right away, but you can be sure he'll be getting some of his root to look into it. Immediate silence descended on the room as Hazashi straightened in his chair and Hiyashi turned to look sharply at him. Sarutobi simply stared. Root. Haruki frowned at the sudden tension in the air before realization flooded him. Eyes widening, he blurted out, "Old man, you cannot be serious." Both Hyugas looked a little startled at his outburst, but Sarutobi only shook his head. "I know Danzo is still in command of a few nin whom are loyal to him, but what you are implying?" Haruki almost glowered as he looked between the three occupants. He finally opted to close his eyes for a moment. "I honestly don't even know where to start," he muttered darkly. Opening his eyes again, he caught the two Hyugas exchanging an unreadable look before turning back to him. "Haruki-san," Hazashi started quietly. "Whatever information you can reveal to us here, you have the word of both myself and Ni-san that we will not question your information source, nor will anything of what is spoken here today leave this room through either of us." Haruki eyed them doubtfully for a moment. "You realize you are placing a lot of trust in someone neither of you actually know. I could be an enemy nin, for all you know." "I do not believe that," Hazashi immediately denied. Haruki scowled at him. "Of course you don't." Hiyashi inclined his head. "My brother has informed me that he has good reason to trust you. I believe him." Haruki sighed and glanced at Sarutobi. The Hokage shrugged and nodded at him. "It is your choice, Haruki-kun." The redhead frowned at him before staring past him out the window. After a long moment of consideration, he started slowly without looking at any of them. "Danzo doesn't just have a few nin loyal to him. He has an entire army." Haruki ignored the uneasy quiet behind him. Root was disbanded under the Yondaime, but Danzo kept it together in secret. It isn't as big as the Anbu troops, but they're well-trained soldiers. Weapons. Danzo made sure to lock their emotions away. They have a cursed seal on their tongue which will paralyze them if they try to speak about Danzo, so you can't interrogate them. Haruki finally turned back to the others, observing the faint shock on each man's face. True to their word, neither Hyuga asked how he had gotten this information, exchanging a few words and frowns between them instead as Sarutobi leaned back in his chair and digested this. "Do you know where Root is hidden?" Hiyashi spoke up. Haruki considered this for a moment. He knew where the future location would be, but he hadn't even known about Root in his timeline at this age, and Danzo was damn paranoid on a good day. There was no way their base would still be in the same place. "No, not right now." He finally settled on a compromise, and saw a flash of understanding cross both Sarutobi and Hazashi's face. Again, Hiyashi glanced at his brother and said nothing more on the subject. "It does not matter," Sarutobi cut in. "You don't have any personal files. I will tell them that I had them destroyed before you left for Kumo. Danzo will make inquiries." Haruki pointed out. "There aren't." His gaze flickered to Hiyashi. "There aren't many people who know me anymore." Sarutobi rested his chin on clasped hands as he stared thoughtfully at the redhead. "I believe your old team was killed on a mission," he said eventually. "Several of the other shinobi of your generation died as well. I don't believe you ever interacted with the other Junin of your age currently in the village before I sent you out on the infiltration." Haruki didn't even bother glancing at Hiyashi this time. "That's flimsy, old man. That would never hold against Danzo." "Does that matter?" Sarutobi asked pointedly. "You kept to yourself and have been gone from this village since you were 18. Who can dispute anything? The only thing the other Junin around your age will say is that they do not remember you. There are shinobi from my days that I do not remember." Haruki threw up his hands in exasperation, forgetting himself for a moment. "Yes, old man, but unlike you, I can't claim senility." A muffled cough made Haruki turn and he just managed to catch Hazashi hide a smile behind his hand. Beside him, Hiyashi's face was determinedly neutral, white eyes blank as he stared ahead. Haruki turned back to the Hokage, only to be faced with an annoyed glare. Blinking, Haruki just shrugged unrepentantly. Sarutobi sighed, shaking his head. "It is the best we have. Should worst come to worst, we will handle Danzo then. For now, it is enough to put him off. Besides, he will be more interested in Hazashi-san's return than anything else." Haruki nodded reluctantly. Danzo would become a major problem eventually, and from experience, Haruki knew he would be a huge pain in the ass. Moving on then, Sarutobi inquired. Are there anyone else in the council you believe will prove a problem? Haruki paused to consider this before shrugging. Well, you can pretty much expect Shikaku-san to not believe a single word, but I don't think he'll say anything. Sarutobi frowned thoughtfully but nodded for the redhead to continue. Inoichi-san and Chusa-san won't kick up a fuss about it even if they suspect something. Those two other council members, Kaharu and Homura, they probably won't suspect anything until Danzo updates them and then they'll back him completely. Again, Sarutobi nodded. He hadn't expected anything else from those two. And the civilian representative is in Danzo's pocket, so he'll go with whatever Danzo wants. Finished, Haruki fell silent to observe the others. Hiashi and Hazashi were talking between themselves again, having frowned when Haruki had mentioned the civilian representative. Sarutobi was taking this in much more easily though, waiting patiently for the Hyugas to finish their exchange. I will keep this information in mind, Sarutobi finally spoke again. For now, we need to finalize our plan and execute it before too much time passes. Haruki-kun, I want you to leave tomorrow morning. How soon can you get to Kumo and destroy the shrine? A day and a half. Hiyashi's eyebrows shot up in surprise but made no comment. Alright, 3 days is the average time a nin can get from Kumo to Konoha. Factoring in rest time for Hazashi-san, we will stage his return 4 days after the explosion. For those 4 days, I will pretend to send you out on a simple information gathering mission to Kase no Kuni. Haruki nodded. On my way back, I can henge into Hazashi-san and let a few people glimpse me. Rumors would start up that way. Sarutobi nodded in approval but Hazashi leaned forward with a sudden thought. One last thing. Wouldn't I be quite a bit weaker once I break the seal? How exactly would I manage to blow up a shrine? Haruki shook his head. When seals are deactivated properly like they should be, there would be no damage to anyone or anything around it. But when a seal is broken by force because it has become weak or someone managed to overpower it, it can cause quite a bit of damage. He paused and noticed he now had a captive audience. Take the life suspension seal for example. Most human beings, even if they are on the verge of death, all struggle to survive for even just 1 more minute. That is every average human's most basic instinct, to survive, to live. Even under a life suspension seal, the body is slowly dying. Much more slowly of course, but still dying. If that seal slips, the body will automatically start struggling against it. It's instinct. As the body struggles, because the seal is still keeping most of the body's functions alive but blocked off, chakra will begin to build up. The seal is like a dam, the chakra build up like a raging river. Water is patient, water can wait. Chakra is the same. Eventually, the dam will burst if not fixed, and like that dam, the seal would also break. After that, I think you can imagine what would happen. There was blatant interest in both Hyugas' faces and, almost like a student at the academy, Hazashi promptly answered, the chakra would explode outwards. And a buildup of chakra like that could destroy a small area. Haruki nodded. Exactly. All I'll have to do is release a burst of chakra strong enough to take out the shrine. Easy enough. It was Hiashi who spoke this time, his question directed at the Hokage even as his eyes remained on Haruki. Hokage-sama, yesterday, I believe you informed me that Kazama-san is adept at Fuinjutsu. His stare grew thoughtful. You do not explain Fuinjutsu theory like someone only adept at the art, Kazama-san. Haruki frowned. That was the simplified version. I mean, I can recite scrolls to you. Rai, the one who taught me, gave me the scrolls. Hazashi shook his head. That is the point. Most novices and even some experts can only recite theory word for word. They are proficient enough at the practical aspect, but if they try to teach others, they simply give them scrolls to learn from. You can talk about it as if you were teaching a class. Haruki stiffened a little, glancing between the two Hyugas. That's how I learn, he finally said. I've never been good with academics. I graduated from the academy at the bottom of my class. And I used to have a very short attention span. When I am handed large sections of text to read, I lose all interest. But I wanted to learn Fuinjutsu, so I compromised. As long as I understood it and I could explain it clearly to someone else, my sensei told me I wouldn't have to memorize it. Eventually, I did memorize all the scrolls, but that took years longer for me. Hiyashi nodded thoughtfully, but it was Hazashi who spoke. Have you ever considered teaching Fuinjutsu? This was obviously the wrong to say, and Haruki's face blanked. No. The two brothers glanced at each other before nodding simultaneously, saying nothing more as they turned back to the Hokage. Sarutobi glanced sidelong at the redhead with something like concern but didn't either. Very well then. We're done here. And I'm running late. I should be handing out missions right now. I'll come with you. Haruki reached into a pocket and withdrew a hair tie, quickly sweeping his hair into a simple ponytail, leaving jaw-length bangs to frame his face. Both Hyugas immediately frowned, another memory tugging at them but staying just out of reach. Before either could say anything, Sarutobi voiced curiously, eyeing the flak jacket he had given the Junin earlier that week as well as the dark long-sleeved shirt underneath, matching trousers, and calf-length sandals. Will you be training today, Haruki-kun? Haruki nodded curtly. Kakashi wants me to join his team for the day. Ah. He caught up to you then. Sarutobi chuckled, rising from his seat. Minutes later, Hiyashi was heading back to the Hyuga compound, Hazashi had retreated into the Hokage's private office, and Sarutobi and Haruki were both heading to the mission assignment room. This is a good opportunity to let the other Junin see you, Sarutobi remarked as they drew closer to their destination. I believe you would know Asuma, Kurenai, and Guy. Haruki nodded distractedly, steeling himself for another meeting with people he had seen die. He glanced at the Hokage walking beside him and, recalling some of the things Asuma had mentioned in passing to him and Shika before his death, suggested quietly, you should make up with Asuma. He may seem indifferent to the rift between you two, but he does care. He just doesn't understand you, and he doesn't know how to try. Sarutobi actually faltered a step as Haruki spoke but recovered quickly enough that Haruki could pretend it hadn't happened. The Hokage was silent until they reached the mission room. At the door, Sarutobi laid a gentle hand on Haruki's arm. The redhead paused, turning to look questioningly at the older man. Sarutobi only smiled. Thank you. I will try. Haruki cleared his throat uncomfortably, nodding jerkily before opening the side door and motioning for the Hokage to enter first. Inside, Haruki immediately caught sight of the familiar senseis of Team 8, 10, Guy, and, shockingly, 7. They all glanced up and straightened when the Hokage walked in, their gazes immediately drawn to the redhead walking a step behind Sarutobi. Haruki. All eyes turned to Kakashi next. The copy nin had actually taken the time to look up from his book and his visible eye was watching the redhead curiously. Haruki smiled a greeting. By your standards, you're early today, Kakashi. Kakashi shrugged, stowing his book away and moving forward, ignoring the odd looks he was receiving from the other senseis. I was over half an hour late. You and Hokage-sama are even later. Haruki shrugged without concern before glancing at Sarutobi, who was watching the entire exchange with far too much amusement. Or rather, he was watching the other senseis' confused expressions as they watched the exchange with far too much amusement. Kakashi never acted this way with anyone. Sarutobi idly wondered what had happened yesterday for the two to seem completely at ease in each other's company. Then again, Haruki was Naruto and he had always thought Naruto could get to anyone if he tried hard enough. The Hokage quickly handed out the day's missions, painting a fence, mowing a field, weeding, and patrol duty for Team Guy, before he nodded a goodbye to Haruki. After this, he wouldn't see Haruki again for several days. As they left the mission room, Haruki walking beside Kakashi to peer down at the mission scroll Kakashi had in hand, the other three senseis immediately drifted closer, all of them eyeing Haruki curiously. Who's your friend, Kakashi? Kurenai was the first to speak, features friendly as she faced Haruki. Kakashi glanced at them before patting the redhead on the shoulder. Ma, this is who I was looking for earlier. Kazama Haruki. You're the one that had Konoha's famous copy nin running around on a wild goose chase. Asuma peered at Haruki with interest. Haruki offered a small smile and nodded as Kakashi's eye twitched. Yes. I guess Kakashi just kept missing me all week. Here, the copy nin muttered something that sounded insistently like, you weren't here. I just came back 5 days ago from a pretty long mission. As Asuma nodded thoughtfully, Guy bounded up, already beaming. Haruki-san. To best my rival in his area of expertise, your springtime of youth must shine brightly in you. Kakashi had whipped out his book the moment Guy had opened his mouth while Kurenai was already face-palming as Asuma sighed on her left. Give it a rest, Guy. Kurenai chided. You're going to scare him off. At least introduce yourself first. Without waiting for the spandex-clad Junin to respond, Kurenai turned to Haruki and offered a welcoming smile. Hi, I'm Yuhi Kurenai, sensei of Team 8. Turning to gesture at Asuma, who nodded cordially, she continued, this is Sarutobi Asuma, sensei of Team 10. Before she could say anything more, Guy leapt in, and I'm Maida Guy. Everyone calls me Konoha's sublime green beast of prey. Haruki chuckled, much to the consternation of the other three. Junin and Kakashi quickly cut in. Guy, no one calls you that. You only introduce yourself to other people like that in the hopes of scarring them for life. Guy just flashed a white-teethed grin. My eternal rival. There is no reason to be jealous simply because you do not have a name as cool as mine. In this time of spring, all shinobi are in the springtime of their youths and thus will discover their own names for themselves. Kakashi had already gone back to his book and now glanced up from it, visible eye disinterested. Huh. Did you say something? Guy took on an affronted countenance, and watching them, Haruki couldn't help but smile wistfully at the banter. Kakashi had died before Guy, and the optimistic Junin had never been the same after that. No matter how much Guy ranted at Kakashi and Kakashi pretended to ignore him, the two had been good friends. Oh, that was so hip of you, Kakashi. But you should listen to me. He turned to Haruki, eager to prove his point. Spring is the best season for one to blossom into true beauty. I prefer autumn myself. Guy looked appalled at this even as the other three looked on, dubious expressions on their faces as Haruki continued the conversation. How could you? Spring is the stage of life where every ninja starts to grow their roots. We can show our springtime of youth to the world as we begin to flourish. Haruki nodded, absently turning his gaze to a nearby window to catch sight of the clear morning spring sky as his voice turned regretful. Yeah, but once we reach autumn, we've led a successful enough life that we've managed to see half of it. An abrupt silence fell around them and Haruki turned back to see all four Junin staring at him in surprise. The redhead shifted minutely as he realized that no one really understood Guy's diatribes, at least not before the first several dozen times. It had taken himself a few years to pick up the subtle insinuations behind the blaring words. As it was, Guy was now staring at him almost thoughtfully, a rare somber expression shaping his features. Haruki hated it. That expression had become far too common during the last years of the war. As it was though, Haruki was careful to keep his face blank. Guy was much more observant than most people gave him credit for. A second later though, the spandex-clad Junin had reached out and clapped him on the shoulder, grin splitting his face again. Yosh. I've decided. Your springtime of youth is indeed exceptional. I would like you to meet my team. They will be delighted to meet such youth. Honestly, Haruki couldn't imagine Neji delighted to meet anyone, especially at this age, and he quickly turned the offer down as he motioned to Kakashi. Sorry Guy-san, but Kakashi's already invited me to train with his team. Perhaps another day. Guy immediately rounded on Kakashi, pointing accusingly at him even as Kakashi heaved a deep suffering sigh. My eternal rival works swiftly when the result is worth it. Very well. You win this round, but... He rounded on Haruki again. Tomorrow, you will train with us, Haruki-san. I insist. Haruki paused briefly, considering the option of leaving a Kage Bunshin behind but dismissed the idea. Sarutobi had already given him a reason to be out of the village and it wouldn't be fair to Guy's team. I'm afraid I am busy tomorrow. Hokage-sama is sending me out on a mission. Kakashi glanced at him. So soon? He asked casually. Haruki hid a smirk. It has been 5 days. Kakashi scowled. He didn't believe the redhead had been in the village since the beginning of the week. It just wasn't possible. Guy looked disappointed but perked up again when Haruki continued, I'll join your team for a training session as soon as I'm free once I get back. Is that all right? The Junin flashed another blinding grin at him. Of course. I will hold you to your word, Haruki-san. His eyes flickered to the window as well before waving his mission scroll in the air. Now, I must be off. It is not very youthful for the sensei to be late. He shot a pointed look at Kakashi, who expertly ignored it, before jogging away, waving a hand in the air. They all watched him go before Kurenai turned back to Haruki. You actually held a conversation with Guy when he's like that. I wish I had your patience. Haruki smiled lightly. He's easy enough to understand if you just ignore the youthfulness. Kurenai and Asuma both chuckled at this and Haruki turned to elbow Kakashi. Come on, sensei. Haruki's hand shot out and snatched the orange book out of Kakashi's surprised grasp. You're the one who invited me and I am not going to be late. He nodded to the other two Junin while holding the book out of a glowering Kakashi's reach before shining away. Kakashi disappeared a moment later, hot on his heels. Asuma and Kurenai blinked before glancing at each other. Have you noticed? Kurenai remarked. Recently, Kakashi's been a little different. Not as late as usual, Asuma agreed. Because of him. Haruki. Kurenai shrugged gracefully before the two started for the door. Maybe. But did you see Haruki-san when he grabbed Kakashi's book? I didn't even see his hand move. And Kakashi couldn't stop him. Asuma nodded contemplatively. He must be really fast. And he got Kakashi moving. His genin team might get collective heart attacks when he shows up on time. He scratched his head. Maybe I should invite Haruki to train with my team. They could definitely use the motivation. I'd like to see what he can do. Kurenai announced. He seems kind of interesting. But it's weird that none of us seem to know him. Asuma just frowned, glancing briefly in the direction where he knew Team 7 trained. That was strange. And now that he thought about it, he hadn't been able to sense Haruki's chakra signal at all, even when they were standing together. Not many could hide their chakra so well, and even less did it in their own village when they were amongst friends. XX. Guy stared thoughtfully in the direction of the Team 7 training grounds as his team started on their taijutsu sets. There weren't many who actually knew what he was talking about underneath all the drama he thought was definitely necessary to brighten the world. Especially not the first time. Guy had been impressed when Haruki had offered his own opinion on the matter. Still, there was definitely something off about the redhead. For one, Guy hadn't missed the depression that had surfaced briefly on the other Junin's face when he had said he liked autumn. That had actually been part of the reason why Guy had immediately offered to drag Haruki to training with them. The depth of that sorrow had troubled him greatly and he hadn't wanted to leave the redhead alone so soon after that. And for another, where had this man come from? Guy was sure he had never seen the red-haired Junin before. Perhaps he had changed his appearance. But surely he would have at least recalled the name. Guy-sensei, are you alright? Guy blinked before smiling winningly down at his only female student. Of course. My youthfulness would not allow me to be anything but. Tenten rolled her eyes but smiled good-naturedly and returned to her katas. Further away, Lee was challenging Neji to a youthful contest of who could do more high kicks and Neji was simply ignoring him but still doing said high kicks with deadly accuracy. Guy smiled broadly at his three students, putting thoughts of the mysterious Junin to the back of his mind for the moment. They were almost ready. He would be entering them into the Chunin exams this year. XX. Good morning. All three genin straightened from their warm-ups and spun around to blink at the approaching red-haired Junin. Naruto was the first to speak up, greeting Haruki enthusiastically. Morning, Haruki-san. Naruto chirped brightly. Behind him, Sakura scowled at the blonde but bowed a little in the redhead's direction and greeted him shyly. Good morning, Haruki-san. Haruki nodded at the kunoichi, studying the more healthy flush to her cheeks. She hadn't developed much muscle yet and there was still some baby fat here and there but Haruki could see she was eating more regular meals now. He turned to the last genin of the group and nodded a greeting as well. Sasuke stared back at him with consideration before nodding as well. He seemed to contemplate something for a moment before finally asking politely, Haruki-san, would you be willing to spar with me? Haruki tilted his head thoughtfully, absently pushing a few stray locks of hair out of his eyes. He glanced back towards the village. Kakashi had managed to snatch his book back a minute before they had reached the training grounds and had disappeared to Kami knows where. It would be a while before the copy nin showed up. He turned back to the waiting Uchiha. Are you finished your warm-up? Sasuke immediately nodded, moving away from Naruto and Sakura before getting into the standard Uchiha-style taijutsu stance. Not fair. Naruto complained, crossing his arms. Why does Sasuke get to spar with you? Kakashi-sensei never spars with any of us. Haruki smiled faintly down at the blonde. He asked, Naruto, if you want, I'll spar with you afterwards. Naruto brightened at that, nodding readily as Haruki moved to stand opposite to Sasuke. Haruki shrugged his shoulders a few times before nodding at Sasuke. Whenever you're ready. The Uchiha darted forward a second later, lashing out with a fist to Haruki's abdomen. Haruki immediately blocked it before jumping smoothly over the follow-up sweep of Sasuke's leg. Haruki frowned faintly when an entire second passed as Sasuke drew back into a ready position before lashing out again, a series of punches and kicks that Haruki easily blocked or pushed aside. This was very boring. Dodging a kick that came from the side, Haruki started pushing back, blocking a fist and reaching out to tap the boy's left shoulder, adjusting a slightly wayward palm thrust before tapping at a rib, and then finally twisting effortlessly past the boy and tapping him on the back of the neck. Sasuke finally jumped back a few feet away, obvious frustration flashing across his face. Haruki held up a hand to momentarily halt the boy. Sasuke, your moves are predictable. Try. Haruki motioned vaguely at the boy in general. Improvising. Sasuke frowned heavily, wiping away beads of sweat that had gathered on his forehead. He seemed about to snap something back but stopped, watching the redhead carefully as he mentally reviewed the spar so far. On the side, Naruto was bouncing on the balls of his feet while Sakura shouted encouragement. A moment later, Sasuke rushed forward again, starting with another fist to the abdomen, but instead of dropping to the ground to sweep out the redhead's feet after his punch was blocked, the Uchiha used his other hand to balance on the ground and kicked his feet up to lash out at Haruki's jaw instead. Haruki easily dodged it but smiled inwardly. For some reason or another, Sasuke was listening to him. So, instead of just mostly blocking or dodging the next rain of blows the genin sent his way, Haruki started adjusting the strikes the boy used. Pushing a fist a little to the left one time and gently nudging a hip into a better alignment during a high kick another, he slowly mended some of the holes in the genin's fighting style. Sasuke seemed to realize what he was doing and accepted it wordlessly, continuing to throw punches and kicks at the Junin. Finally, panting hard but still determined, Sasuke leapt away and into the air, quickly bringing his hands together to form the seals for a jutsu as he started falling back to the ground. Kaden. Gokaku no Jutsu. Haruki had already recognized the signature hand signs and now quickly danced away, the fireball soaring harmlessly behind him even as he felt the heat stream past. The fireball quickly faded away and Haruki turned to look down at Sasuke who was gasping for breath as he rested his hands on bent knees. But Onyx's eyes met his evenly and there was a certain amount of defiance in them as he stared back. Sasuke, you cheated. Naruto bounded forward, Sakura a step behind, already reaching out to bop Naruto on the head. Sasuke-kun didn't cheat. She glanced hesitantly at Haruki. He didn't, right Haruki-san? Haruki glanced briefly at the two other genin before looking back at Sasuke. He remained silent for a few seconds and wondered if the boy would look away. He didn't. Satisfied, Haruki jerked his head a little and the hair tie that had been holding back his hair snapped, having been too close to the fireball to escape damage. Haruki watched impassively as all three genin stared wide-eyed when the hair tie fluttered to the ground and crimson locks fell around his shoulders again. Waiting until he caught Sasuke's gaze again, Haruki offered him a single nod and a faint smile of approval. Much better, Sasuke. The raven-haired genin straightened at the praise, eyes lighting up as a pleased smile tilted his lips for a moment. Haruki glanced at Naruto with an arched eyebrow. Naruto, I didn't say no ninjutsu. There is honor in battle, but we are ninja, and most of what normal people would consider underhanded, we call it fair game. And in a real fight, there are no rules. Your enemies will not abide by any standards you set. Understand? The blonde nodded, frowning hard as he digested this, and Haruki turned back to Sasuke. Cool down with some katas and drink some water. The redhead withdrew a scroll and unsealed a bottle for the boy. From now on, try developing your own fighting style. Your clan's style is a good foundation to build up from, but you'll need more variation if you want to strengthen your taijutsu. Sasuke nodded attentively before sketching a half bow, respect flickering in his eyes when he looked up again. Thanks, Haruki-san. Haruki managed a small nod, but almost reeled inside as he heard the genuine gratitude in the boy's voice. He couldn't recall Sasuke ever thanking anyone at this age. Then again, he had been the dead last back then. Sasuke was hardly going to thank him. My turn now, Haruki-san. Haruki smiled and nodded, glancing at a nearby tree as he waited for Naruto to finish a quick stretch. He had sensed the copy nin's presence a moment before his spar with Sasuke began, and he now wondered what Kakashi was trying to do by letting Haruki spar with his students. Lazy bastard, Haruki muttered under his breath as Naruto got into position in front of him. Not going to pawn your students off on me, my ass. Ready, Haruki-san. Haruki studied the blonde with concealed amusement as the boy couldn't seem to stop moving from excitement. Whenever you are. Immediately, Naruto brought his hands together and Haruki really did smile at the familiarity of it. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. 7 clones appeared around them, all holding kunai, and Haruki cocked his head and glanced around before focusing on the real Naruto again. Come then, he voiced, letting a challenge edge his tone. Let's see what you can do. All 8 Narutos grinned and charged, simultaneously lashing out with their kunai as soon as they reached the redhead. Haruki dodged the swipes without difficulty, noting the wide sweep of each reckless strike. Clumsy, Naruto, he called out as he continued to avoid the kunai. Don't just swing at my closest body part. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sasuke draw closer to their spar before restarting his katas again. That just wastes both energy and time. Aim at openings. If your opponent doesn't have openings, then make one. He ducked a rather wild swipe of a kunai from one of the clones before flipping back, balancing on one hand as his left leg came up, catching said clone under the chin and throwing him into the air. Following through, he twisted his body as his right leg came up as well and caught the clone from the side, neatly tossing him away and sending him crashing into the trunk of a tree. The clone disappeared in a puff of smoke as Haruki righted himself again and watched the remaining Narutos back away. Make an opening. The Naruto near the back scratched his head. How do I do that? Surprise me. When Naruto still looked confused, Haruki clarified. Do something unpredictable, Naruto. You're good at that. Play to your strengths. Another moment of thought passed before a wide grin grew on the blonde's face. You asked for it, he called out almost gleefully as he brought his hands together. Haremu no Jutsu. Sakura immediately began yelling as 6 Narutos turned into beautiful naked blonde females. Haruki caught a glimpse of Sasuke wheeling around to face the other direction and heard a faint spluttering sound from the tree Kakashi was still sitting in. Grinning, he shook his head as he felt the real Naruto run at him from behind. Dodging at the last minute, his hand reached out and snagged the boy by the collar before tossing him neatly into the group of female clones. Good distraction, Naruto, Haruki called out cheerfully. But that won't always work. You need to follow up on it if it doesn't. I know. Haruki's gaze slid to the side as another Naruto came charging at him, leaping into the air with his kunai drawn. So the boy had made more Kage Bunshins behind the smoke his earlier jutsu had produced. Haruki smiled even as he sidestepped the Bunshin and flipped him to the ground face first where it dispersed. Good. Naruto was learning. 3 more Kage Bunshins came up from behind, but Haruki caught 2 of them with quick sharp jabs to the abdomen before flipping away from the third. The Bunshin followed him though, hands balled into fists as he charged the redhead. Haruki glanced briefly at the ground as he balanced on his hands and quickly swiped up a familiar item, snapping it towards the Bunshin. The clone reeled backwards when the hair tie hit him between the eyes, and Haruki quickly took the opportunity to swing around and sweep the clone's feet out from under him. Straightening again, he noted that the female clones had been dispersed, but the Naruto clones were still going strong. There were nearly 24 of them in the clearing now, scattered around in a loose circle around him. We've got you now. One Naruto shouted as they all charged with childlike battle cries. Haruki sighed, tucking a few stray locks of hair behind one ear as the clones descended on him, some coming from the air, others charging at a flat-out run. With the ease of someone who had done little save train, eat, sleep, and fight in open battle, Haruki launched into a counterattack, executing his own punches and kicks to disperse the clones one by one. Up in his chosen tree, Kakashi observed the spar, unable to look away. This was the first time he had seen Haruki fight, and the grace and strength in each action had him mesmerized. Even earlier, during the spar with Sasuke, when Haruki had chosen not to fight but to only silently fix the holes in the Uchiha's fighting style, Kakashi hadn't even pulled out his book. The way Haruki had adjusted each stance or punch had Kakashi wondering if Haruki had ever taught before. Now, the copy nin absently speculated whether or not Haruki would agree to spar with him sometime. Kakashi suspected the redhead had yet to show even half of his real skill in taijutsu, and he wanted to see how far he would have to push the other Junin for him to show his true strength. Leaning forward even more, he squinted suddenly, picking up some familiarity in the somewhat odd style Haruki was using. Wasn't that the Hyuga clan's gentle fist style? Haruki wasn't closing off any tenketsu points, but he was definitely targeting certain areas with deadly precision. Where the hell had Haruki learned the Hyuga's prized taijutsu style? And it wasn't just the gentle fist. Haruki used a mix of martial arts, all molded together to form the unique style he now used with easy efficiency. There was the graceful stance and direct but subtle palm thrusts that Kakashi was sure was a variation of the taijutsu the Uchiha clan used, and as Haruki danced out of reach of the Naruto clone's attacks, Kakashi could also see bits and pieces of the taijutsu that the Nara clan usually stuck to, as well as. He leaned forward even further, ignoring the fact that he would have probably toppled out of the tree by now if he hadn't been a ninja. That was definitely the unique style only Guy knew and taught to that equally disturbing protege of his. The redhead had just pulled off konoha senpu that Guy used and had created. But Haruki had just met Guy this morning. There was no way he could know that. Down below, Haruki finished off the last of the clones with a series of high kicks that sent all three Naruto lookalikes into the air, tumbling away head over heels and dispersing before they could hit the ground. Whirling around, he caught the fist that had been aimed at his back and with a gentle but deft twist only strong enough to throw the blonde off balance and spin him around, Haruki had Naruto's arm neatly pinned behind him as he flipped out a kunai and finished the spar by tapping the flat side of the weapon against the boy's left shoulder. I believe this match goes to me, Haruki said mildly as Naruto craned his head around to scowl up at him. Smiling slightly, he released the blonde and Naruto scrambled up, shaking out his arm as Sasuke and Sakura approached them. You're crazy strong, Haruki-san, Naruto complained as he flopped onto his back, blonde locks damp against his forehead. Sasuke came to a stop beside them and towed the blonde. Dobi, you need to get faster. Naruto glared up at the Uchiha, swatting away the genin's foot. Shut up. I already know that. Naruto. Sakura had her hands on her hips and was scowling down at him. Don't be so rude to Sasuke-kun. He's giving you good advice. Naruto huffed sulkily before sitting up and peering at Haruki, who had unsealed another water bottle and was now holding it out to the blonde. Naruto grinned and took it, downing half the bottle in one go. Good job, Naruto. Haruki sank down to a crouch in front of the blonde. Your use of Kage Bunshin is excellent. What you need to work on now is polishing up your taijutsu and, of course, increasing your speed. Right now though, I'm more concerned about your fighting style. You don't follow the standard style the academy teaches, and while that's good for keeping your attacks unpredictable, it also means you don't have a very strong foundation. Naruto frowned, glancing up at Sasuke, who was listening just as intently. The senseis show us some stances in the standard style, Naruto admitted, rubbing the back of his head. But we usually have to learn from the scrolls they give us. He made a face. I don't like sitting all day studying. Sasuke snorted while Sakura just sighed, but Haruki nodded instead. That's all right. Not all shinobi learn best by studying. You're better at learning by doing, right? At Naruto's immediate nod, Haruki stared thoughtfully at the blonde before glancing up at Sasuke. Sasuke, If you were the one fighting Naruto earlier, what would have happened? The Uchiha had an instant retort at the tip of his tongue. I would have won. Haruki arched a challenging eyebrow even as Naruto protested loudly. With no trouble. Sasuke's curt nod seemed to stall halfway through the motion as he glanced briefly down at Naruto. Then, with obvious reluctance, he admitted grudgingly, I might have had some trouble defending against all the Kage Bunshins. His second jutsu, Haruki hid a smile at the boy's obvious embarrassment at this. Would have been distracting as well, but it would be his clones that would be dangerous since they can come at all sides. Haruki nodded. How would you have defended against that then? Sasuke cocked his head, a faint frown making its way onto his face. I would have used my fireball jutsu to get rid of most of them. Because his taijutsu is sloppy, I would be able to dispatch any remaining clones by myself. Haruki nodded again and turned back to Naruto. And you, Naruto, if you had been fighting Sasuke, what would you have done if he had countered by doing this? Naruto scowled, striking an unconscious thinking pose as he dropped his chin in one hand. I would have made more clones to distract him. Blue eyes suddenly sharpened slyly as he glanced up at his rival. And then, while he was busy with them, I'd attack from his left side, from behind. Haruki's eyes narrowed as Sasuke started slightly. Oh, and why would you do that? Naruto grinned brightly as he pointed at Sasuke's left leg. You hit Sasuke 3 times there back when you were sparring with him. His left side is obviously not as well defended as his right side and his leg should be at least bruised from the spar. It's a weakness. Sasuke scoffed loudly but subtly shook out his left leg. Haruki smiled in approval. Naruto really did learn better by watching doing things hands-on. Good observation, Naruto. In battle, every weakness should be exploited. He rose to his full height again, eyeing them both thoughtfully before nodding decisively. Train together, he advised, much to all 3 genins' surprise. Both of you have weaknesses that the other can see through. Sasuke is more disciplined and has a better grasp of his own actions when he attacks, but Naruto has better instinct and he's good at improvising when he gets into tough situations. You can help each other improve in different areas. I think you'll find a spar between you two interesting. The 2 boys glanced at each other, curious but trying not to show it at the same time. Haruki smiled a little, ignoring the sadness that welled up inside him. In his timeline, Sasuke had been his favorite sparring partner. Every spar they had managed to fit in before things really went to hell had been truly enjoyable. Alright then, I've talked enough. Haruki turned to blink at the last of Team 7's genin. Sakura, would you like to spar? The kunoichi blushed a little, hands wringing uncomfortably as she glanced at Sasuke who was suddenly concentrating on drinking more water. Maybe not right now. I don't think I'd do very well. Before Haruki could respond, Naruto, with his usual amount of non-existent tact, piped up, come on, Sakura-chan. It'll be fun. Sasuke and I couldn't win either. But you could learn some things. Naruto. Haruki cut in, and Naruto's mouth closed with a click at the redhead's sharp tone, blue eyes wide when he caught sight of Sakura's rapidly reddening face. That's all right, Sakura. Haruki drew her attention again before she could lash out at the blonde. Actually, it's probably best that you don't spar right now. Kakashi has an exercise for all of you that I think you'll do especially well in. You'll probably move on to more advanced stuff today and you'll need your energy for that. Sakura blinked up at him in confusion, though she seemed a little relieved at the change of topic. What exercise? Oh yeah. Naruto scrambled to his feet, dusting his jumpsuit off. Kakashi sensei said we were going to learn chakra control today. When did he say that? Sakura rounded on the blonde. Naruto grinned. Yesterday, after we had dinner with Haruki-san. Both Sasuke and Sakura turned to look at Haruki, who shrugged, trying not to scowl at his younger counterpart. Kakashi wanted to meet me. Naruto invited him around, and we all ended up eating at my place. Without waiting to hear what either of the other 2 genin thought about this, Haruki hurried on, turning to stare directly at the tree Kakashi was still sitting in. Speaking of Kakashi, why don't you come down and actually teach, sensei, or have you decided to just sit on the sidelines for the rest of the day? All three genin peered in the direction Haruki was looking at, and a second later, Kakashi dropped out of the tree, orange book in hand as he strolled towards them. Yo. You're late. Naruto and Sakura snapped as Sasuke looked on. This time though, none of them seemed particularly upset by the Junin's tardiness. You were here all along too. Kakashi I smiled at them and waved his orange book at them. Well, I was in the middle of a great chapter. Miki-chan seduced. He got no further than that before Haruki flipped out a kunai and eyed his orange book menacingly. Not in front of minors, Kakashi. Kakashi chuckled nervously and quickly tucked his book away. Behind Haruki, Sakura and Naruto were making faces and even Sasuke looked faintly disturbed. Well, I suppose we should get started on our training session today. You guys still have AD rank to finish afterwards. Follow me. As the three genin trailed after Kakashi into a more forested area of the training grounds, Haruki fell into step beside him. You've been watching since I started sparring with Sasuke, he commented. You could have come out sooner. Kakashi shrugged unrepentantly. It was interesting to watch. He paused to glance sidelong at the redhead. You knew what you were doing. Have you ever taught before? Haruki predictably stiffened and remained silent, gaze focused ahead. Once, he finally revealed without looking at the copy nin. A long time ago. And only for a little while. Kakashi nodded and said nothing more. He knew he probably wouldn't get anything else out of the redhead if he continued to push. Now then, the group had come to a halt at the base of three moderately tall trees. You three are going to climb a tree. Climb a tree, sensei. Naruto's face fell as he glanced at the trees in front of them. How does that help? Climbing a tree without using your hands, Kakashi amended before moving forward to demonstrate. To the side, Haruki tuned the copy nin out as he explained the concept to the three genin. He moved a little ways away where the trees were farther apart and scanned the small clearing. He could still see Team 7 from here and it was big enough for his jutsu. Returning to the others, he noted the mild annoyance on the two boys' face as they gazed up at Sakura, who was already sitting on one of the upper branches. Good. Quietly, he moved to where Kakashi was standing, drawing the Junin's attention. Kakashi, may I teach Sakura how to walk on water? The copy nin turned a puzzled eye on the redhead. I don't mind, but Naka River's pretty far from here. Haruki shook his head. I have a jutsu that Sakura can use to practice with. Kakashi's eye lit up with interest. I'll come too. The boys are probably going to be at it for a while. Haruki nodded and moved away, coming to a stop at the base of Sakura's tree. Sakura, he called up. You're pretty good at climbing trees already. If you want, I can teach you how to walk on water next. Perched on the branch, Sakura brightened a little. She had thought Haruki was only being nice when he had told her earlier that she would be good at this exercise, but it came pretty easily to her. She wasn't sure if he would really teach her something else since she had turned his offer down the first time, but the Junin now waited patiently for her reply. Okay. She called down, concentrating chakra at her feet again before descending the tree. She jumped the last several feet and shot the redhead a surprised smile when he automatically reached out to steady her. He nodded back and motioned for her to follow him. You can do it, Sasuke-kun, she called out encouragingly as she passed the other two. Pausing, she added fairly, you too, Naruto. She felt Haruki's eyes on her and glanced up in time to catch a startled look passing over his usually neutral features, but the redhead looked away again before she could ask. Nay, Sakura-chan, where will you be going? Naruto's tone was tinged with envy and even Sasuke looked over at her. Flustered as she didn't really know, Sakura glanced up at Haruki again as he answered. Just over there. He nodded to a small clearing a short distance away. I just need a bit of space to use my jutsu. Sakura could practically feel the excitement emanating from the boys and she could admit to a little curiosity herself as she accompanied the two Junin to the clearing. Stepping away, Haruki brought his hands up and went through a long series of seals. Sweden. Kagami no Mizu. The air in front of the Junin seemed to waver before a swirl of white chakra extended across the clearing, a thin plane of light briefly lighting up the area and then fading away again as the quiet sound of rippling water reached their ears. In front of them, a thin plane of water that took up the entire clearing but was only perhaps an inch thick floated about a foot above the ground. Drawing closer, Sakura's eyes widened as she realized that it was indeed a lake. Quite literally, bottomless lake. Ducking her head, she swept her hand under the flat plane of water and found nothing but empty air beneath it. Mystified, she turned to face the red-haired Junin even as Kakashi stepped up beside her to peer into the water. Sasuke and Naruto had completely abandoned their trees and had hurried over as well, enchanted by the jutsu. Impressive, Haruki, Kakashi commented, dipping a finger into the water and setting off a ripple effect. How deep is this? Haruki shrugged, stepping up beside them and looking pleased that he seemed to have caught their interest. I have no idea. I've never tried to touch the bottom. But how? Sakura stammered, dipping a hand into the clear lake. The water was cool against her skin. Besides the occasional ripple caused by some invisible wind that Sakura knew wasn't real because the wind that ruffled her hair was blowing in the opposite direction, the water was the clearest of blues. It was the most beautiful lake she had ever seen. It's a combination of water ninjutsu and space-time ninjutsu. Haruki explained. Basically, it's a dimensional pocket filled with water. Why? Water of mirrors? Sasuke inquired from the ground, having dropped into a crouch and was trying to stick one hand into the lake from underneath. Said hand passed completely through the plane of water, dry and untouched. Haruki pointed at the sky. It reflects the weather. Have you noticed the wind? It's blowing east today but the ripples in the lake are moving west. It's a calm, sunny day so the lake is calm and clear as well. His mouth twisted into an odd smile. In a storm though, this lake becomes a typhoon. That is so cool. Naruto crowed, looking about ready to dive in. Before he could move though, Kakashi's left hand had dropped onto his head and his right onto Sasuke's. All right you two, Kakashi announced cheerfully. Back to work. You're supposed to be climbing trees. This lake is for Sakura right now. Visibly sulking, Naruto stalked back towards his tree, throwing longing looks over his shoulder as he reluctantly moved away. Sasuke lingered as well, a scowl etched on his face as he headed after Naruto. Both looked determined to master climbing trees before the day was out or die trying. Alright Sakura. Haruki turned to the pink-haired Kunoichi. It's the same concept as climbing a tree, but water is always moving so you'll find balancing that much harder. Give it a try. Sakura nodded resolutely and placed a foot on top of the water, testing the surface as she made sure her chakra coated her feet evenly. 3 small wobbly steps later, a particularly large ripple threw her off balance and she dropped into the lake with a loud splash. Spluttering as she came up again, she caught Haruki's gaze and felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she clung to the thin edge of the lake. Hey! A hand dropped on top of her wet locks as the stern voice made her look up. None of that. You got 3 steps, Sakura. When I first started, I couldn't even get 1 step without soaking myself to the bone, and that was after I half killed myself learning how to climb a tree. A giggle slipped out before she could stop it and Sakura glanced apologetically up at the Junin, but Haruki only grinned back at her, amusement clear in bright cerulean. Your chakra control is near perfect so if anyone can get this down in a day, it's you. Now get back to work. I didn't summon a lake just to give people pep talks. This drew a grin from her even as Haruki stepped away, and she used the edge of the lake to heave herself out of the water to try again, confidence restored. Her chakra control was pretty good, not to mention Haruki did seem to think she could do it and the Junin had yet to be wrong about anything. She was going to learn how to walk on water by the end of the day if it killed her. Retreating from the lakeside, Haruki settled himself against a tree and found himself joined by Kakashi a moment later. My students are going to be demanding a switch of senseis by the end of the day, the copy nin told him mournfully. Haruki just rolled his eyes. Don't sell yourself short, Kakashi. Just pay them all equal attention and push them a bit. Kakashi tilted his head to study him. You handle them pretty well. Haruki shrugged. They remind me of my old team. Kakashi glanced across the clearing as Sakura fell in again. Your students. Haruki frowned and shook his head. No. My team. The team I was on. Quote. Who would you be then? Kakashi asked lightly, cautious of the redhead's reaction. Haruki's mouth twitched up into a bitter smile. Like Naruto, I guess. Kakashi mentally compared the two. One quiet, the other loud. One patient, the other brash. One calm, the other hot-tempered. But both friendly enough. Both unpredictable. And both charismatic. I can see that. He nodded, only to be met with a sad smile. You shouldn't, Haruki said quietly, tilting his head back to set his gaze on the morning sky. I never want to see him turn out like me. A frown crept onto his face as Kakashi studied the redhead. It was clearer right now, but no matter where he saw Haruki, yesterday in his apartment, back in the mission assignments room, even during the spars with Naruto and Sasuke, a shadow of something dark and unhappy always seemed to cling to the Junin, never letting go. I'm rambling again. Kakashi blinked when cerulean eyes turned back to him and Haruki rubbed the back of his hand, much like Naruto, he noted. I still do that, now and then. Sorry. Kakashi shrugged, eye smiling at him to assure the redhead that he didn't mind. The sadness still remained though, so he subtly led the conversation in another direction by nodding at Sakura. The kunoichi seemed to be able to walk 6 or 7 steps or so before slipping a bit, but she didn't completely fall in anymore. So I'm guessing that jutsu is yours. Haruki smiled a little. Yes. I created it several years ago. And you know space-time ninjutsu. It was not a question. Haruki heaved noncommittally. Some. Kakashi arched an eyebrow. You said that about Fuinjutsu. Haruki shrugged. It's true. Kakashi gave him a flat stare. You transferred those seals from paper to wall with a drop of your chakra. Most people who know some Fuinjutsu can't even get it off paper. I practiced a lot. And I suppose I have a knack for it. Kakashi just shook his head and glanced back at the lake. He was itching to try out this jutsu and was now kicking himself for keeping his Sharingan hidden earlier. Would you like to learn? Kakashi glanced over and scratched his head sheepishly at the amused smile on Haruki's face. Ah, well, you went through quite a lot of seals earlier. Use your eye then. I'll go through them one more time. Kakashi started, turning sharply to face the redhead. How did you know? He finally asked. Haruki's mouth pulled up into a grin that never reached his eyes. I know everything, Kakashi. Abruptly, he pushed off of the tree to face the copy nin. So do you want to learn? Kakashi studied him for a moment longer before nodding silently and reaching up to uncover his eye. He wasn't sure what Haruki meant, but it wasn't as if it was a great secret either. He was called Konoha's copy nin after all. As soon as his Sharingan focused on Haruki's hands, the redhead quickly went through the seals again and Kakashi memorized them, making a mental note to start practicing the jutsu as soon as he had some free time. Space-time ninjutsu was nothing to fool around with in a real fight if he didn't actually know how to use it properly. Thanks, Kakashi said as Haruki finished. He quickly hid his Sharingan again and the two were soon back to observing Sakura practice her chakra control. You give out your jutsus pretty easily, Kakashi remarked after a short silence. Haruki chuckled. I've got more in my arsenal, Kakashi. That jutsu I just showed you was one of the earliest I created. How old were you when you made it? 16. Maybe 17. Kakashi snapped his head around at this. You made a water and space-time ninjutsu combination when you were a chunin. Haruki opened his mouth as if to refute this but closed it again and settled on a stiff nod. There was a strange look on his face now but it was gone when Kakashi blinked. But I've never seen enemy nin use it before. Surely someone would have been able to figure it out and copy it eventually. Kakashi pointed out. Haruki shrugged. All the enemy nin I used this jutsu against aren't in any condition to try to reproduce it. Kakashi blinked before nodding reluctantly. He supposed that made sense but he had a feeling he was missing something here. There was a sudden yell from the trees and both Junin turned to look as the sound startled Sakura enough that the kunoichi went under again. By the trees, Naruto seemed to have made it halfway, lost concentration, but had somehow managed to transfer chakra to his hands and was now hanging from a side branch by his palms. Kakashi's sweat dropped. That's different, he commented, watching the blonde flail in midair as he contemplated whether or not he should give his student a hand. I've never seen that happen before. Haruki smirked, leaning back against the tree again. Leave him. He'll figure out how to get down on his own. Kakashi shrugged and settled back as well. You have a lot of faith in him. With Fuinjutsu and this. Haruki turned to glance at Naruto, who would no doubt become Hokage one day. At Sasuke, who would become Anbu General and Naruto's trusted second. And at Sakura, who would be Naruto's head medic and the occasional nudge to keep the blonde focused. I have a lot of faith in all of them. Haruki turned a smile on Kakashi, less shadowed and more genuine. They'll be great one day. XX. 3 hours later found Haruki walking through the village, having parted ways with Team 7 a few minutes earlier. Sakura could finally walk across the lake without falling in, though she still wobbled almost drunkenly every few steps. Naruto and Sasuke had managed to reach one of the topmost branches of their respective trees but had yet to actually stick there for longer than a few seconds. At that point, Kakashi had announced that it was time to do their D-rank mission and all three had reluctantly stopped their training. But while the boys had been smudged with dirt after all the times they had face-planted back to earth, at least they were both still completely dry. Sakura on the other hand had been soaked from head to toe and highly embarrassed as she shivered next to her teammates. Haruki and Kakashi had taken one look at her before they had each picked up one of the boys and promptly dumped them into the lake. Naruto and Sasuke had surfaced quickly, one shouting while the other glared, but Sakura had started laughing even as she had made a valiant attempt to look sorry. All three had been ordered to go home for a change of clothes before meeting up again for their mission, and Haruki had excused himself for the rest of the day, explaining that he still had a few errands to do before his mission tomorrow. All three children had had varying degrees of disappointment etched on their faces, but Kakashi had nodded and wished him good luck on his mission before ushering his students away. Now, Haruki found himself walking a familiar route down a side street to where one of his future students lived. In his timeline, he hadn't met Kasaragi Yusuke until the boy was 12 and he was 18 and saddled with a genin team by the Godime. It had taken one look for him to realize that the boy was being neglected and a grand total of 3 weeks to remove the boy from his home and into Haruki's. Up ahead, Haruki caught sight of a familiar head of dark brown near black hair, walking hand in hand with a tall man with similar features. Haruki stiffened but kept his distance. Yusuke had eventually told him that the negligence and occasional abuse had only started after his mother had died in a house fire. Before that, his father had been a good man and as good a father as anyone could ask for. Judging by the 6-year-old's smile as he listened to his father speak, the mother probably hadn't died yet, which meant that Yusuke still had an opportunity to keep his family intact. Haruki couldn't take the kid if there was nothing wrong. Weighing his options, he decided it was better this way. Yusuke was 6, not 12, and Haruki wouldn't be able to stick around as much. He wasn't a sensei anymore and he would probably need to leave the village from time to time. He wouldn't have time to look after a child on top of everything else. Mind made up, Haruki quickly summoned a small orange-furred fox. Stay out of sight and follow them, Haruki ordered softly. Protect them. Make sure nothing happens to any of them. The fox dipped his head to show he had understood before trotting away, disappearing into the hedges of a nearby house. Satisfied, Haruki turned and walked away. Perhaps, in 6 years, this time's Naruto would become a sensei again. And perhaps the Godime would see fit to give him the same 3 genin she had given Haruki in his time. XX. Welcome. Haruki nodded a greeting at the smiling shop owner as he stepped into the bookstore. He hadn't actually been planning to stop by this place, but his feet had taken him here and he had decided that another trip later would only waste time. He automatically moved to a section set apart from the other books, gaze skipping over the rows of distinctive orange spines before coming to rest on the plain brown covering of the book he was looking for. The shop owner blinked down in some puzzlement as Haruki brought the book over to the counter to pay. She had watched the Junin head over to the special section set aside for the legendary Sanin's books, but most who wandered over there came back with at least a few volumes of Ika Ika. She shrugged mentally and quickly accepted the money that the handsome redhead held out. Oh well. The less perverts in Konoha the better. Thank you and please come again. Haruki nodded his thanks and headed for the door, tail of the utterly gutsy shinobi tucked under one arm. He had read it numerous times already, but the book was still his favorite read. XX. Haruki's next stop was a clothing store for ninja and he immediately headed over to the coat section, scanning the trench coats on display with a critical eye. His old coat had been made by Shizune as a gift for becoming Anbu General. He had loved the short-sleeved, open-collared, chakra-infused, midnight blue coat with tongues of flames decorating the bottom edge, coupled with pockets on the outside for his hands and on the inside for storing weapons and poisons. He had worn it everywhere after Shizune had presented it to him, much to the woman's delight. The medic had admitted that she had based the design on his father's coat after hearing a description of it from Tsunade, but Haruki had been quick to assure her that he didn't mind. Unfortunately, said coat had been all but shredded barely halfway through his battle with Madara and he had been forced to leave it behind. The redhead finally decided on a simple dark brown trench coat, lightweight and durable and similar in cutting to his old one. It would do for now, until he could perhaps convince the Shizune in this timeline to make the coat again. He just didn't feel right without a long overcoat thrown on over his uniform. XXX. Haruki's final stop for the day was, of course, the Hokage Monument. Thinking back, he figured he had spent a good third of his time in Konoha simply sitting on the edge of the mountain staring out across the village and beyond that. The view was always excellent from so high up and he had done everything from drinking sake to napping to doing absolutely nothing up here. Standing here now with his eyes closed and the wind weaving through his hair, Haruki could almost pretend that he was still in his own time, back before Konoha had fallen, and was simply waiting for Team 7, all of Team 7, to join him on one of those rare days when they were all free from their duties for a few hours. With a sigh, his eyes blinked open and he settled down into his usual spot on the Hokage Monument, leaning against one of the spikes of the Yondaime's hair. With his eyes open, everything was different. There were no foreboding dark clouds on the horizon like there had been throughout the entire war. The clouds made it seem as if the battlefield was an entirely different world. It could be as bright and sunny as any summer day could be, but the world darkened and the temperature dropped the moment one stepped onto the battlefield. And the village. It was almost sleepy, lazy, careless. The village he had come to recognize as his own had always had a certain tension and weariness weighing it down, as if Konoha itself had been tired with the war. Now though, in the distance, Haruki could make out the civilians talking easily with one another and a smattering of shinobi exchanging easy conversation, happy and ignorant of all the things that would eventually lead this village to its doom. But that was what he was here for. The future was his burden to bear. His duty was to give these people a chance to live out their lives on their terms. And this time, he would not fail. XXX. Sunrise saw Haruki slipping out of the village unseen, hair tied back and brown coat flapping behind him as he ran through the forests of his home country. He never had much opportunity to just let loose and run to his heart's content anymore, but if he kept up this speed, he could run straight out of Hai no Kuni and right through Yu no Kuni and Shimo no Kuni before hitching a ride with Kurama to reach his destination in the promised day and a half. XXX. Hokage-sama. Sarutobi glanced up at the formal address as his two counselors filed into his office. Homura. Kaharu, he acknowledged. What can I do for you? Word has reached Konoha of a sudden explosion of chakra in Kumogakure, Kaharu began stiffly. And there have been sightings of someone who appears to be Hyuga Hiyashi in Yu no Kuni and Shimo no Kuni. We wish to know if you have received any information on the recent events. Sarutobi hid a satisfied smile and frowned thoughtfully instead. I have spoken to Hiyashi-san, but he too has expressed his lack of knowledge on the matter. I have also checked over the recent missions, but we have not had many requests from either of those countries, and no Hyuga has been sent on the ones that have come to us. Both of his old teammates frowned and Homura took over for the two. Yet there must be some sort of connection. The rumors that have leaked back to us were very clear that the man that was sighted has Byakugan eyes. Sarutobi mentally congratulated Haruki on a job well done, making a note to have the man's pay ready for him upon his return. Before he could come up with a reply though, rapid light footsteps reached their ears and all three of them turned to face the open doorway as a Chunin skidded to a stop just outside the office. Hokage-sama. The Chunin sketched a hasty bow in the general direction of all three shinobi in the office before focusing on Sarutobi. Sir, a man, definitely a Hyuga, just appeared at the gates. He claims to be Hyuga Hazashi. Sarutobi forced a look of surprise on his face as he watched his counselors stiffen with shock. Before either could say anything, Sarutobi quickly rose to his feet. You are certain, he said. Hazashi. The Chunin nodded. Yes, sir. The Junin at the gates asked several times. Sarutobi nodded curtly. I will go myself. Please go to the Hyuga compound and inform Hiyashi-san of this development. The Chunin shook his head. Hiyashi-sama is already there, Hokage-sama. I believe he sensed the man's chakra signal and went to verify it himself. Sarutobi came out from behind his desk. Then I think I will join him. Homura. Kaharu. Both counselors nodded grimly and all three shinobi swept out of the Hokage tower, the Chunin leading the way. As they passed one of the open windows in the hallway, Sarutobi instinctively glanced outside, just in time to catch a familiar flash of crimson disappearing over one of the nearby rooftops. XX. This is a surprising turn of events indeed, Hokage-sama. Why was the council not informed of such a significant development? Once Hyuga Hazashi had been confirmed as Hyuga Hazashi through 2 blood tests, a verification of his chakra signal, curse seal, and Byakugan, and a somewhat lengthy interrogation that Hiyashi adamantly insisted on performing, the council, the clan and civilian representatives, Danzo, the newly returned Hazashi, the Hokage, and Haruki had all assembled in the council chamber. Sarutobi hadn't wasted any time and had immediately launched into the heavily edited version of what had really happened, introducing Haruki and explaining his part in the discovery and resulting retrieval of the Hyuga clan head's brother. Haruki had stood at his shoulder, face about as helpful as a stone wall when the other occupants in the room all tried to gauge the redhead's reactions throughout Sarutobi's explanation. Currently, Homura was staring frostily at Haruki even as he directed his question at Sarutobi, but it was Hiyashi who answered, rising from his seat amongst the clan heads. This was a problem for the Hyuga clan to deal with, Hiyashi stated coolly, white eyes surveying the room. When Kazama-san returned with news of my brother, I requested that this matter be dealt with quietly and discreetly. It could cause a potential war with Kumogakure if a spy was discovered to have been in their territory, and by handling this issue as we have, Kumo cannot claim ignorance of my brother's survival, his gaze hardened here. As they did on the attempted kidnapping of my eldest daughter 9 years ago. A quiet murmur spread across the room and Sarutobi watched Inoichi and Chuza nod in acceptance of this justification while Shikaku remained still in his seat, a calculating glint in his eyes as his attention remained on the redhead standing behind Sarutobi. He said nothing though and the Sandaime let his gaze move on to the other occupants of the room. The civilian representative was frowning heavily, occasionally glancing at Danzo further back in the room. Danzo remained expressionless, seemingly weighing Hiyashi's words as Homura and Kaharu exchanged a few words between themselves. Very well. Hiyashi-sama, Kaharu accepted grudgingly, nodding at Hiyashi as the man sat down again. This issue seems to have been handled quite efficiently. We will now be able to demand compensation from Kumo's raikage, which will be quite beneficial for Konoha. And wonderfully executed, Kazama-san, Inoichi added, blue-green eyes on the Junin at Sarutobi's side. Haruki dipped his head in acknowledgement. Thank you, Inoichi-sama, but credit must also go to Hokage-sama and Hiyashi-sama, as well as Hazashi-sama. I simply followed their plan as instructed. Sarutobi remained neutral on the outside but he felt a thrum of worry inside. The plan was undoubtedly suggested by Haruki. For the future Hokage to downplay his skill as a strategist, Sarutobi knew the redhead wanted to remain unnoticed for as long as possible. And to blatantly lie in front of the council, the Sandaime wondered just how dangerous Danzo was to make Haruki this cautious. Of course, Chuza nodded from next to Inoichi even as Shikaku cocked his head and the interest on his face went up another notch. It was here though that Danzo finally spoke up, shifting forward to stare intently at Sarutobi. I do wonder though, Hokage-sama, where this Kazama-san came from. I have never seen his face before, nor do I recall sending any Junin to Kumo for infiltration. Sarutobi didn't even blink. I destroyed all his files, down to his academy records before sending him to Kumo as a spy. If he had been caught and traced back to Konoha, Kumo could demand much worse from us. And I do not remember needing to inform anyone before sending out any of my shinobi on a mission. The reprimand was subtle but sharp, and Danzo reluctantly backed down, inclining his head as he settled back in his seat. There was a slightly tense silence as Sarutobi glanced around the room before speaking again. Then for now, this matter is closed. I will send a courier to Kumogakure to request a meeting with the Raikage, but everything we have discussed here obviously cannot be leaked out. Concurrent nods responded this statement, and Sarutobi continued. Then this meeting is adjourned. As everyone rose and bowed to the Hokage before making their way to the doors, Sarutobi glanced over his shoulder at the impassive redhead. Get some rest, Haruki-kun, he said softly. You've done very well. Come by the office tomorrow and I'll have your paycheck ready. Haruki blinked, his neutral features never shifting as he sketched a slight bow before heading to the door as well. He waited patiently for the others to file out first, never missing the drilling stare from across the room where Danzo still stayed seated, before making his own way out of the Hokage Tower. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he stepped outside, but stiffened again when he felt a somewhat familiar presence approach him. Haruki-san. Haruki turned to face Shikaku, maintaining an iron control on his expression as he gazed back at the scarred features of one of his future best friend's father. He had gotten to know this man in his own timeline, spending hours at a time crouched over battle plans with him and his son. The Junin commander had an odd, crooked smile on his face, the one Haruki had come to recognize as one that Shikaku always wore when he had discovered something particularly interesting. At the moment, it was an unnerving expression for Haruki. May I help you, Shikaku-sama? He asked politely, remembering the correct honorific for the strategist. Shikaku only waved a lazy hand in the air before tucking it back into his deerskin coat again. Shikaku is fine. And perhaps you could. Intelligent dark eyes sharpened as the smile widened fractionally. How would you like to play a game of shogi with me? Chapter 5 of Opinions and Games. By the time Haruki reached his apartment, he was tired, hungry, and beyond irritated. Really? Did he have spend time with me tattooed on his forehead or something? Tossing his coat onto the couch, he made his way to the kitchen, grimacing as he remembered being accosted by 3 different people before finally reaching his flat. Earlier. How would you like to play a game of shogi with me? Haruki stared for a long incredulous moment, mind racing to find a good excuse to turn Shikaku down. Naruto never did anything for no good reason. Of course, they thought not doing something because it was troublesome was a good reason, but there must have been an alternative motive for the Junin commander to ask. I'm not all that good, Shikaku-san, Haruki voiced uncomfortably, slipping his hands into his coat pockets to hide their minute restlessness. It was true. In his timeline, both Shikaku and Shikamaru had kicked his ass almost every time they had played, though both Naruto had admitted that he had become more and more of a challenge to defeat as time passed. He had even won the last few games he had played with them, but after Konoha had been destroyed, none of them had had time for shogi anymore, and Haruki hadn't so much as touched a piece in over a year. Well, I can be the judge of that. Shikaku's posture was still in a somewhat lazy slouch, but his eyes never wavered from Haruki's. Shikamaru has training tomorrow until late afternoon, and the other people I usually play with are all busy, so I won't have a shogi partner. Here, Haruki snapped mentally, you have an entire clan of shogi partners. They can't all be busy. And you're the clan head. You can order them to play with you if you want your shogi fix so badly. You can come over to the Nara compound any time before that. A dozen excuses raced through his mind, just as quickly dismissed a second later. Shikaku would counter every one of them anyway. It wasn't that he didn't particularly like playing shogi, he really had nothing against it, but to Haruki, he would technically be sitting across from a dead man, most likely fielding questions the entire time because he had no doubt Shikaku had seen through the earlier farce and would probably want answers, and that was fine because Haruki had expected it. What he hadn't expected was for the Nara to come straight to him. He had figured that Shikaku would go bug the Hokage and Sarutobi would be the one stuck with dealing with the Junin commander. And the other problem he found with Shikaku's request was the fact that he knew Shikaku's playing style inside out. This didn't matter in his timeline since Shikaku knew his playing style as well, not to mention that it had been the father and son whom had taught him how to play in the first place. But here in this timeline, Naruto would have quite a bit of an advantage, and it wouldn't be fair to Shikaku. So here he was, impassive on the outside but somewhat frantic on the inside as the Nara clan head waited for his reply. Somewhat belatedly, Haruki realized that he had been silent for several long seconds already, and though Shikaku looked as patient and unbothered as ever, the silence around them was beginning to turn awkward. I am busy tomorrow, Shikaku-san, Haruki finally threw out, shoving down a flush of embarrassment when the Nara clan head raised a half-skeptical, half-amused eyebrow at him. Oh. The Junin commander cocked his head, and the slightly mocking edge that his smile had taken on was definitely calling the redhead out on his bullshit. With what? Perhaps we could schedule the match afterwards. With. Haruki casually turned to his left and gestured vaguely in that direction to stall for time. And lo and behold, his gaze fell on a familiar figure, and he almost cheered when he realized his excuse had, quite youthfully, presented itself to him. With training, Haruki announced triumphantly as he turned back to the waiting Nara. I promised Guy-san I'd train with his team as soon as I got back. He turned away again, unconsciously forgetting his current Junin status and reverting back to his cage voice, as Sasuke liked to call it, in his haste to bow out of this conversation with Shikaku as soon as possible. As it was, his voice, now sharp with command, cut through the murmur of other ongoing conversations around them as he barked out, Guy-san. Haruki didn't notice the slight widening of Shikaku's eyes, nor did he notice the immediate, instinctive straightening in the Junin commander's posture, but he did take notice when everyone within earshot abruptly stopped talking, slightly bewildered expressions all turning to face him. With one word, Haruki had managed to seize the attention of all those in the area. Quickly realizing his mistake, Haruki only let slip his alarm for a fraction of a second before he clamped down on the rush of anxiety welling up inside him and walked forward to meet a stunned-looking Guy, ignoring those around him. It wasn't as if he had even shouted. His voice had been the same volume as it always was. He had simply changed the tone, albeit reflexively. Guy-san, I promised a training session with your team after I came back, didn't I? He managed a small smile, for the Junin and Guy seemed to give himself a mental shake before his usual bright grin spread across his face again. Indeed you did, Haruki-san. You are truly a man of your word. Guy glanced distractedly at Shikaku, still standing a few feet away, but hesitated to greet him when he realized that the strategist's entire attention was solely focused on the redhead. Shikaku hadn't really meant to approach the recently returned Junin on their way out of the Hokage Tower. Oh, he knew the story Sarutobi had spun had been just that. A story, with bits and pieces of half-truths slipped in to hold the entire thing afloat. It had been put together quite nicely, with a few small holes here and there that, had he been privy to the truth, Shikaku would have patched up without a problem. Sarutobi's plans usually did have minute gaps in them, as the Hokage didn't always catch all the minuscule details and left that up to the Junin commander to take care of. But it was also this exact reason that Shikaku knew that the red-haired Junin was hiding something big. Sarutobi's plans always had at least a few tiny flaws in them, but the approach that Haruki insisted that the Hokage, along with the two Hyugas, had supposedly come up with was completely airtight. It was the exact method Shikaku would have used in that same scenario, because it was the best course of action with the least amount of backlash. And it was completely different from the Sandame's style of approach. The plan brought up questions, of course, like where had Haruki come from, because there was no way an entire village could have no knowledge of one of its shinobi no matter what records Sarutobi destroyed, and how had the Junin managed to get to Kumo and back within the hypothetical 4 days it took for Hazashi to make the return trip, while stopping several times along the way to henge into the Hyuga clan head's brother to spread rumors, but Shikaku wasn't interested in these questions. It was obvious to anyone with eyes and half a brain that Sarutobi trusted Haruki explicitly, and Shikaku trusted his Hokage enough to not question this line of thought any further. No, what interested him was the core of the plan itself, the tactic that Shikaku knew had not come from Sarutobi or either Hyuga. The Nara had worked with all three at one point or another, and he knew that none of them could have come up with a plan so similar to one Shikaku himself would make. Which only left this Kazama Haruki as the only other option. It was brilliantly done. Within less than 2 weeks, the red-haired Junin had returned Hyuga Hazashi alive and safe. Protected Konoha from any outside force looking to gain something from this incident, achieved a concrete standing within the ranks of Konoha's ninja as a loyal and capable shinobi in the eyes of most, if not all, of the council, secured the favor and debt of two of the most powerful Hyugas in the Hyuga clan, and finished off the entire performance by cornering and crippling Kumo in one decisive strike, delivering to the Hokage a golden opportunity for Konoha's economy on a silver platter. Shikaku had seen and heard all this under the incomparable fiction that Sarutobi had recounted, and, sitting there in the council chamber and not seeing any true comprehension on any of the others' faces, it had been one of the rare times that the Junin commander had felt truly frustrated towards the less insightful minds around him. He had felt a little like bashing heads together and a little like screaming because none of them, not even Danzo whom Shikaku knew had also seen through some of the layers of deception, none of them had been able to see the true beauty of what Haruki had done. Heck, Shikaku wondered if even Haruki knew what he had done, standing there with stony features that seemed unsettlingly out of place on a frighteningly familiar face, all the while downplaying his own skills and redirecting the credit to the more powerful players in the web they had spun. But either way, it had been Haruki who had come up with the plan, and it was Haruki's mind that now intrigued him to no end. So, in an uncharacteristic move on his part to satisfy his own curiosity, Shikaku had called out to the red-haired Junin, and he had found himself amused when he realized that Haruki couldn't lie at all. How could this man possibly be a spy if he couldn't even lie to his own allies who wouldn't be looking for anything suspicious? No wonder Haruki had stayed so quiet back in the chamber. And Shikaku believed that right up to the moment when Haruki had called out to Maeda Guy, which had then promptly blown the Junin commander's conviction clear out of the water as he had found himself automatically straightening to attention at the tone of voice the redhead had used. Sharp, even with the weight of command, and quiet, even with the expectancy of respectful deference, Shikaku would swear blind up to the day he died that he had been listening to a cage speak, a cage used to snapping short rapid-fire commands out of necessity that those who reported to him could and would immediately understand and obey. And now, here he was, still standing in front of the Hokage Tower, more determined than ever to con the man back to the Nara compound for at least one round of shogi. He wanted to know how this man thought, and there was nothing more telling than a game that pitted one mind against another. Guy. Shikaku finally dragged his gaze to the spandex-clad Junin standing beside them and nodded a greeting at him. Guy sketched a quick salute, a wry glint in his eyes as he studied his commanding officer. Shikaku let his frame relax again and tucked his hands back into his coat. He sometimes forgot that Guy was one of the sharper Junin under his command. What time should I come by? Haruki was asking now, and the calm demeanor and steady gaze made Shikaku wonder just how he could think that this man was not capable as a spy. Guy struck a thinking pose before flashing a grin. Yosh. Lee's youthfulness usually has him training by 5, but the official meeting time is 6. You can come to training grounds 14 anytime between then. Haruki inclined his head. I will be there. Do your students specialize in any area? Lee is a youthful taijutsu specialist while Neji has his clan's gentle fist. A fleeting frown passed over the Junin's face. And Tenten is excellent with a wide variety of weapons. He seemed about to add something more but changed his mind at the last second and grinned again. I will go tell my students that we will have a youthful guest for training tomorrow. We will aim to impress. Haruki smiled and nodded, and Guy clapped a good-natured hand on the redhead's shoulder before snapping another salute at Shikaku. Before he could run off, Shikaku quickly cleared his throat, sharp eyes darting momentarily back to Haruki and just managing a glimpse of the slight stir of relief under the redhead's neutral features. Oh no you don't, Shikaku scoffed inwardly. As if a training session could put him off if he really wanted something. Guy. He spoke aloud. Haruki-san is unsure whether or not he can make the shogi appointment with me tomorrow. Around what time would you be willing to let him go? Guy looked surprised but smiled broadly, missing the dark look that Haruki tossed at both of them. Shikaku smirked inwardly. So there was a fire somewhere under that placid facade. Do not worry, Haruki-san. Guy beamed. A youthful game of shogi, especially against a master such as Shikaku-sama, is something that cannot be missed. Our training session will end at noon since my team has border patrol tomorrow. Will that be enough time for you to make your appointment? Haruki's smile looked strained and Shikaku bit back a chuckle. Oh, undoubtedly, Guy-san. Thank you for the consideration. Yes. Shikaku nodded as well. Thank you, Guy. That will do nicely. Guy just flashed another smile before sprinting away in the direction of the training grounds, kicking up dust as he ran. A long moment of silence followed as neither of the remaining shinobi spoke. Shikaku spent the time studying the redhead, unconcerned that his open observation might seem rude. He idly speculated whether Haruki would get angry or not, and if he would insist on turning down the shogi game anyway. The Nara might be the Junin commander, but that didn't mean his Junin needed to obey him in matters unrelated to work. And for a reason he had yet to figure out, he very much doubted that this man was suited to obey anyone. But after a few drawn-out seconds, the redhead only sighed and pinned him with a piercing cerulean gaze. You are used to getting your way in the few times you want it, Shikaku-san, Haruki said at last. Shikaku blinked in surprise but relaxed with a lazy smirk playing on his lips a heartbeat later. And you are much more straightforward when you lose that act you parade around in. Haruki shrugged. I prefer being straightforward. Shikaku's gaze sharpened. Then be straightforward. I'm not calling you out for work-related issues, Haruki-san. It's just a shogi match between two colleagues. Work has nothing to do with this. Haruki studied him for a moment longer before his whole bearing seemed to change in front of Shikaku. He watched as the redhead relaxed somewhat in his presence and the walls that had been resurrected in his eyes fell away, revealing amusement and faint annoyance behind them. His mouth twisted up a little in a faint smile as one of the Junin's hands reached up to brush back a few strands of crimson bangs. All right then, Shikaku-san, Haruki dipped his head before stepping away, more as acknowledgement than anything else. I will come by the Nara compound tomorrow at 1. Do try not to be too disappointed when you fail to find out what you want to know. And with only a passing wave goodbye, the redhead disappeared a moment later, shining away from the Hokage tower and leaving a mildly shocked Shikaku behind. Shikaku stared after the Junin before huffing a laugh, shaking his head as he turned towards his own home. He could honestly say that no ninja under his command had ever left his presence like that, without all the tedious bowing and saluting that his position called for. It was an interesting change, and he found himself mildly impatient for tomorrow to come. He always found out what he wanted to know in the end. It was just a matter of how long Haruki would manage to put him off. XX. Running across the rooftops, Haruki grumbled wearily to himself. Now he was stuck with playing shogi with the Nara clan head, and he couldn't blatantly downplay his skill either. Shikaku would catch it immediately and call him out on it, and knowing his luck, Haruki would be stuck with another shogi appointment after that. He would have to be subtle about it or Shikaku would realize just how much Haruki actually knew. A moderately fast approaching chakra signal made him glance up and Kakashi appeared beside him a moment later, matching him step for step as the copy nin smiled a greeting at him. Yo. Welcome home. Haruki almost tripped at those two words, catching himself at the last moment as his mind momentarily threw him back to the last time he had ever heard them, 2.5 years ago, and the final time he had ever stepped foot inside Konoha before the war had kept him on the battlefield. He hadn't returned to his village until Konoha had become the battlefield. He managed to smile and nod but said nothing else as he sped up a bit, not really wanting to talk. Kakashi seemed to understand and kept his next words short and simple, but very unwelcome to Haruki. The team's coming over to your place for dinner at 7, okay. We'll knock on your door when we arrive. And without giving Haruki a chance to turn the invitation down, the copy nin pulled away, disappearing over the rooftops in a blur of silver. Haruki would have given chase and kicked the Junin's ass 6 ways to Sunday if he wasn't sure that that would do nothing to get him out of this. So he clenched his jaw and put his frustration in his steps instead, being careful not to actually punch holes through the rooftops though. Present. Now here he was, stewing sulkily over a simple bowl of udon as he lounged on his sofa. What was wrong with the people of Konoha? Either they hated him and stayed as far away as possible unless they were trying to hurt him, or they couldn't seem to get enough of his company. Haruki heaved a sigh and swallowed down the rest of his food before placing it on the coffee table and stretching out on the sofa. While he did have large chakra reserves and his need for food and sleep had greatly diminished after spending so much time trying not to get killed on the battlefield, it didn't mean he didn't get tired. 4 days out and about on a diet of soldier pills wasn't healthy, but he'd done it before and for much longer periods of time. 4 days was nothing in comparison, but he wished he could have a night into himself right after completing the mission. It wasn't like Kakashi wouldn't understand that either. For someone who knew what it was like to come home from a mission and just get some rest, Haruki wondered what had happened in his absence for the copy nin to seek him out so soon after he had come back. Ah well. He would just have to wait until tonight to find out. For now, a nap wasn't sounding so bad and he would need the extra energy to deal with Team 7 later. XX. A quiet knock on his door woke Haruki up and he jerked out of his half-doze to stare blearily at the kitchen clock just visible from his position. 6:30. Well, he had either slept through the entire night without knowing and Kakashi had come to wake him up, or the copy nin was shockingly early. Hauling himself off the couch, Haruki ran a hand through his hair and tried to look less tired than he felt before opening the door. Judging by the veiled concern that immediately sprang up in Kakashi's eye when the man caught sight of him, he had probably failed. In no mood for pleasantries, Haruki frowned at the other Junin, not quite ready to let the man in just yet. This had better be good, Hatake. Naruto and Sasuke had a fight. Without a word, Haruki stepped back from the door to let the copy nin inside, closing and locking the door behind him before joining the Junin on the couch. Sighing, Haruki settled down against one arm of the couch and motioned for Kakashi to start talking. The copy nin absently fingered the orange book tucked in his jacket but didn't take it out. I took them to Naka River to practice walking on water, Kakashi finally started, an uncharacteristic agitation in the subtle way that his left fingers tapped out a random rhythm. Haruki would have thought nothing of it if he didn't know the copy nin so well. The boys finally finished with the tree climbing after the second day, so I started them on the next step. I still can't do that jutsu yet, Kakashi added with a disgruntled note to his voice. Anyway, they started out with the usual falling in and splashing around. Sakura's gotten pretty good and I started her on walking through the rougher parts of the river, but she was close enough to give them pointers too and they both gradually got better. Overall, it went pretty well. Haruki raised an eyebrow, question silent but clear. So what's the problem? Kakashi sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose through the cloth of his mask. The problem was when they took a break from water walking. On the day they started that exercise, they broke for lunch and started sparring after they finished eating. The Junin glanced at the redhead. The boys took your suggestion and started sparring. It didn't end well. Haruki frowned and Kakashi hurriedly tacked on, the spar itself was a good idea. You were right. They saw through a lot of each other's attacks, so they managed to figure out what they still had to work on. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that Naruto won. Again, Haruki let his silence speak for itself. But he could already see where this was going without Kakashi having to continue. Sasuke had never taken defeat well, especially when he was still at this age. It wasn't as if it was a decisive win either, Kakashi continued. They were even until one of Naruto's Kage Bunshins managed to sneak up on Sasuke's left side and disarm him before he could retaliate. But you know Naruto. He gloated a bit, harmless enough, and Sasuke was more than a little annoyed, but he didn't really get angry until Sakura cut in. Haruki had to hide a wince. No doubt, Sakura would have said something in favor of Sasuke and mostly insulting to Naruto. Kakashi heaved a sigh, shoulders slumping. She said something about Naruto only getting lucky because Sasuke didn't expect him to do something as cowardly as sneaking up from behind. Naruto didn't take that well and said that Sasuke would have done the same thing if he had been strong enough to produce more than a couple Kage Bunshins, and things just went to hell from there. I don't even remember all the insults they shot at each other, something about Naruto being weaker than Sasuke, and Sasuke never being able to get strong enough if he couldn't even defend against a Kage Bunshin, and then parents were somehow thrown into the mix before I could shut them both up. Naruto's an orphan and Sasuke's clan's gone, so that didn't go over well and they were full out brawling before I could stop them. He ran a hand through his messy hair and shook his head. I managed to pull them apart and send them home after that, but the team dynamics are completely skewered. Naruto and Sasuke refuse to work with each other and they're both ignoring Sakura. The poor girl's already apologized multiple times to both of them, and I'm pretty sure she went home crying after yesterday's failed D rank, but. Haruki closed his eyes and tried to force back a headache. He should have known the camaraderie he had seen between Team 7 was too good to last. He opened his eyes again, shifting to cross his legs on the couch and shot the Junin an inquiring look. So what exactly do you want me to do about it? Kakashi rubbed the back of his head uncomfortably as he leaned back against the couch. I need help. I've tried talking to Sasuke, and I told him that he would get stronger and encouraged him to, but he just shuts out everything I say. Why? Why does he listen to you? Haruki stayed silent for a long contemplative moment, propping his head up in one hand as he used one knee as an elbow rest. He studied the copy nin for a while, watching him slowly stiffen uneasily under his blatant stare. You know what your problem is, Kakashi? Haruki finally asked when he felt that the Junin had suffered enough. The Kakashi in his timeline had eventually realized his mistake, but not until it was too late and Sasuke was long gone from the village. Without waiting for a reply, Haruki continued, straightening up as he dropped his hand back onto his lap. You're too soft on Sasuke. The copy nin's visible eye widened fractionally and Haruki sighed and explained, why did you only talk to Sasuke? Naruto may have won and Sakura may have inadvertently started the fight, but it wasn't as if Sasuke hadn't done anything wrong either, and he knows that. And yet you're singling him out, and I know you're trying to make him feel better by telling him that he will get stronger, but he doesn't see it that way. Sasuke called Naruto weak as well, but you didn't tell Naruto that he would get stronger too, did you? By singling Sasuke out, to him, you're telling him that he is weak because you obviously think that he needs his hand held, unlike Naruto or even Sakura. But I don't think that. Kakashi was blinking, looking mildly stunned as one hand jerked in unconscious denial. Yes, you know that and I know that, Haruki pointed out calmly. But Sasuke doesn't. I told you, Kakashi, to pay them all equal attention. I didn't just mean for training. You have to be careful of the way you act around them as well. You're their sensei. They'll always be watching you. If you keep treating Sasuke differently, his eyes darkened with memory. Not only will you push Naruto and Sakura away, you'll lose Sasuke as well. What could be seen of Kakashi's face paled as he slumped back against the couch. He wants to become an Avenger, Kakashi revealed after a long moment of silence. There was a note of helplessness in his voice that startled Haruki. The Hokage. He assigned me Team 7 on purpose. He thinks I can help him for some reason. It isn't just because I can teach him how to use the Sharingan either. The Sandaime thinks I can somehow keep him from going off on his own for revenge or something. There was a disquieting amount of self-doubt in Kakashi's eye when the copy nin made eye contact with Haruki again. How the fuck am I supposed to do that? Haruki could honestly say that, after everything he had been through, he had never thought he could ever be truly surprised again. But this was a side of Kakashi that he had never seen before, not in all the long years he had known the man. Had his times Kakashi felt like this? He must have, since he was technically an alternate version of the same man. But Kakashi had always seemed so self-assured when dealing with their team. He had never shown any uncertainty when handling them, and he and Sakura had eventually assumed that Kakashi just favored Sasuke, liked him better perhaps because he hadn't been as annoying or as undisciplined as they had been. But now that Haruki thought about it, he realized that the copy nin had never had to deal with children before Team 7. Kakashi had said so himself. He had failed every genin team before them, and to be suddenly told that the first team he had ever passed and taken on consisted of an angry 12-year-old bent on revenge that he was responsible for keeping on the straight and narrow would unnerve anyone. And yet, Haruki had never seen it, had always just thought that Kakashi hadn't seen much in him as a 12-year-old. But what if the copy nin had only been trying, in the way he had thought was best, to keep the team together and prevent Sasuke from defecting? What if it hadn't been favoritism after all? Well, he had proof right in front of him. Kakashi looked as uncertain as one could possibly look under the circumstances. I'm sorry, Haruki spoke up abruptly. Kakashi looked taken aback. For what? For misunderstanding, Haruki voiced softly before giving himself a sharp mental rebuke. Never mind. Well, if Sasuke wants to become an Avenger, then all we have to do is get it into his head that cutting ties with this village is the last thing that will help. Kakashi scratched his head, shifting with a nervous sort of energy. We. Haruki snorted, rising to his feet and grabbing the empty bowl still sitting on his coffee table before moving to his kitchen. Well, I certainly hope it's we. You've already decided to turn my apartment into your base of operations. Kakashi followed him into the kitchen, having the decency to actually look sheepish as he leaned against the counter. You're good with kids, and especially with them. Sasuke wouldn't want to go anywhere near Naruto's place right now, and it would be a cold day in hell when he invites us into the Uchiha compound. I don't want to scar Sakura's parents for life if the boys end up in another fistfight in Sakura's house, and my place. Kakashi shrugged, a slight smirk made its way onto his face behind his mask. My precious books are there. I didn't want anything destroyed. Your place was the only one left. Haruki threw him a dirty look as he put on the kettle. So it's all right for them to destroy my place then. Kakashi stared pointedly first at the empty bookcase outside the kitchen. The only book Haruki had bought was on his bedside table, then at the bare minimum of dishes and bowls in the cupboards, before waving a hand in the general direction of his apartment's bare walls. Your place is practically empty. And I'm willing to bet that there are seals everywhere. If the boys get into a fight, the only cause for concern is the damage they'll do to each other. Besides, this was the only house I could convince them to come to without too much fuss. I told them you wanted to see them. Haruki rolled his eyes before settling back into something more serious again. Kakashi still looked a little unsettled, and Haruki sighed before catching the Junin's eye again. You asked earlier why Sasuke listens to me. Haruki started softly, finding it rather sad when Kakashi seemed to hang on to his every word. How could this man be so afraid of letting his students down? Yet Haruki had never realized it. He listens because I treat them all the same. He knows I'm fair and that I'm just as hard on him as I am on his teammates. He's seen that firsthand when I made sure to give them all an equal opportunity to train with me. I pointed out what he and Naruto could work on, and what areas they were good at. I made them figure out each other's strengths and weaknesses after I sparred with them to force them to acknowledge each other as equals, not just a prodigy and a dead last. And I made sure Sakura got the attention she needed when it was obvious she was much better than either of the boys at Chakra Control. No singling them out. Pay them all equal attention and push all of them to be the best they can be in their own way. As Haruki finished, the silence that descended on them was only broken by the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock. The redhead couldn't quite decide what Kakashi was feeling at the moment, since the Junin had his best poker face on as they stared at each other. But it was Kakashi who finally chuckled and relaxed, returning to his typical laid-back air. Just so you know, the copy nin informed him cheerfully, voice light again. I don't believe any of that. Not teacher material, stuff you insist on. You realize you just gave me a lesson on my own students, right? Haruki rolled his eyes and started pulling out drawers to start on dinner. Whatever. Hatake. When your students get here, you can talk to them in the sitting room. I'll start on dinner while you give them the third degree. If they don't shape up, you'll be stuck failing D-rank missions with them for the rest of your life. Kakashi offered him a lazy salute and sauntered out of the kitchen to make himself comfortable on Haruki's couch again. The redhead smiled a little when he saw that the languid confidence had returned to the copy nin's slouch, and silently activated the privacy seals around the sitting room when a knock came at the door. This was no longer his Team 7 anymore, and it was up to them now to pull themselves together. Haruki could give a nudge now and then to move them along, but he wouldn't be here forever, and Team 7 would have to stand on their own someday. XX. When Haruki finished making dinner, miso soup, rice, tomatoes, tempura, deep-fried tofu, and a side dish of dumplings. One favorite of each of the members of Team 7, he made his way to the sitting room, deactivating the privacy seals when he found them sitting around his coffee table and chatting companionably. Or at least Naruto was talking while Kakashi and Sakura contributed occasionally as Sasuke listened on, but any rift between them seemed to have disappeared. Naruto and Sasuke were sitting beside each other on his couch, faint bruises marring a cheek and an eye but fine overall, while Sakura had taken the armchair by the window, now bright green eyes slightly red but still smiling at something Naruto was saying, and Kakashi had settled on the floor, leaning against the wall opposite the couch. He was much more relaxed, Haruki noted, and there was a certain pride in his visible eye as the copy nin surveyed his students, not all of it for them either. Haruki looked too, at the contented faces of his old team members and at his own younger counterpart, for once comfortable in his own skin in the knowledge that the company he was keeping welcomed him, and he couldn't quite help the jealous resentment and overwhelming loss that welled up in his chest and clogged his throat for a moment. It isn't fair, a part of his mind whispered. This is the team I want. It isn't fair that they get it and I never did because my team never had help. We were left on our own and tore ourselves to pieces trying to stay together. It isn't fair. Haruki. Kakashi's voice snapped Haruki out of his thoughts and the redhead was immediately ashamed of himself. This was his job, his duty to make a better future for everyone in this timeline. He had no place actually trying to fit in. There was no point anyway, he would disappear once his time was up. Kakashi had noticed the moment Haruki had pulled down the privacy seals of course, and had seen him approach. He had assumed that the redhead would join them or at least call them for dinner, but the other Junin had stopped just outside his student's line of sight, hovering in the doorway and half hidden in the shadows to watch them. Out of the corner of his eye, Kakashi had observed the flash of jealousy and that crushing depression that sometimes surfaced on the redhead's face when he thought no one was looking. And it was his team that had caused it, of that there was no doubt as the copy nin watched the man stare at them with a painful sort of longing twisting his mouth down. So he had quickly called out, intent for the Junin to join them. Haruki had been a big help in pulling his drifting team back together and Kakashi's task of keeping Sasuke from going off the deep end didn't seem too out of reach anymore. What he hadn't intended to do was draw out the immediate shame that followed his greeting, shoved away under neutral features again before his students had even turned his way. Haruki only turned back to the kitchen again, tossing a quiet, "Dinner's ready," over his shoulder before disappearing from their sight, and Kakashi wondered if Sasuke was indeed the one who needed support right now. "Nay, sensei, is Haruki-san all right?" Kakashi glanced distractedly at his blonde student as he rose and headed after their host. Honestly, he didn't think the redhead was all right at all, hadn't thought that since the very first time he had met Kazama Haruki, but he couldn't exactly say that to Naruto, could he? Of course, Naruto. Kakashi I smiled down at the boy, remembering to include Sasuke and Sakura as well when he noticed their attention on his answer. He's probably tired. He did just come home from a mission today. Then why are we bothering him? Shouldn't he be resting? Sasuke's accusing glare told Kakashi that the Uchiha knew exactly why Kakashi had told them to meet at Haruki's apartment and was obviously not pleased that they seemed to be cutting into the redhead's life again before he even had a chance to settle back in. Kakashi found it rather cute that his moodiest student could worry so much in his own subtle way. "It's fine, Sasuke." Haruki's voice caught their attention and they entered the kitchen to see Haruki setting the table. Even in the dim kitchen light, there was no mistaking the pronounced shadows under weary cerulean, but the redhead only continued, "I took a nap earlier and I do need to eat. Come sit down." Sasuke only shot another glare in his sensei's direction, who at least had the decency to look a little guilty, before moving forward and reaching out a hand for the dishes that the Junin was juggling. "I can set the table, Haruki-san. You've already made us dinner." He found himself under Haruki's appraising stare and forced himself to look back steadily. There was something about the older man's stare that made Sasuke, not uncomfortable, but maybe a little anxious, whenever that sharp scrutiny was turned on him. It never made him feel inferior or as if he had to prove something to the Junin like he had felt when the teachers back at the academy had always expected him to be the best, but Sasuke found himself wanting to do better because the only expectation he ever found in Haruki's eyes was for him to give his best, nothing more, nothing less. He sometimes thought it might be easier to look away when that blue gaze pierced him, but somehow, he knew instinctively that that would disappoint Haruki more than anything else. "So long as you can meet my eyes without fear or shame," the gaze always seemed to say. "There is nothing you could ever do to disappoint me." And for a reason Sasuke had yet to figure out, he didn't want to disappoint this Junin that had already helped him with his training without holding back all that needed to be said. Praise and criticism came in equal amounts from Haruki, which was already more than Sasuke had gotten from any of the instructors back at the academy. He wasn't quite sure what to make of Kakashi yet, though he had been leaning towards scorn after the copy nin had kept trying to single him out for the past few days, but he had decided to withhold his judgment after the discussion earlier. Kakashi had been uncharacteristically sharp with all three of them, forcing them to apologize for their own actions and not letting them so much as twitch from the sitting room until they had managed to sort out their differences. Sasuke had to wonder if Haruki had given their sensei any advice on dealing with his team. He must have. Sasuke hadn't ever seen Kakashi early for anything. Alright. Haruki interrupted his thoughts with a slight smile as he handed the dishes to Sasuke. Thanks. We'll help too. Sakura bounded into the kitchen with Naruto half a step behind her, and the three genin were soon bustling around the dinner table, setting out plates and bowls and chopsticks. Kakashi had shrugged and taken a seat beside Haruki, ignoring the stern looks of disapproval from his three students. Leaning sideways, he murmured, "Mind telling me how you got them to wait on you hand and foot?" Haruki kicked him gently with a scowl marring his features, and Kakashi grinned back unapologetically. The depression seemed to have lifted somewhat, and the copy nin would count that as a victory. This is really good. Several minutes later, they were all seated around the table, digging in with enthusiastic delight after the first bite. Haruki chuckled quietly, thanking the kunoichi with a nod. "Nay, Haruki-san, where did you learn how to cook?" Naruto stared back at him, blue eyes curious. Haruki's mouth twisted a little, eyes hardening briefly before softening again. "My godfather taught me a while back. He was a bit of a traveler, and he insisted that any ninja who didn't know their way around ingredients were as good as dead if they ended up stuck in the middle of nowhere with no provisions." He paused before quirking a rueful smile at his guests. "Then he told me that I had to know my way around a kitchen because he was as good as dead if he had to keep eating the stuff that the people at the hotel we were staying at served us. And he didn't want to work. So," Haruki shrugged, snickering inwardly at the incredulous looks on his audience's faces. "I learned how to cook." "Wow." Naruto scratched his head. "Your godfather is really lazy. Kinda like Kakashi-sensei." Kakashi twitched, shooting an annoyed look at the blonde. Haruki laughed outright at that. "Oh, he's exactly like Kakashi. You could ask anyone who knew him. They would all describe him as lazy and perverted." Sasuke snorted, a smirk twitching at his lips, while Sakura giggled and Naruto grinned on either side of the Uchiha. Kakashi turned his annoyed expression on him, kicking him back for the comment. Haruki grinned openly at him and said nothing more, picking up his rice bowl again. None of them mentioned the noticeable past tense that Haruki used when talking about his godfather, content to simply take the redhead's words as Haruki wanted them to. The rest of the evening was spent making idle conversation as the three kids took turns recounting the embarrassing failure of their D-rank mission yesterday. The tension between them was gone, and even Sasuke stayed relaxed in his seat when Naruto teased him about his abysmal performance during the mission. Of course, the Uchiha pointed out the blonde's mistakes right after that, and the two descended into a light banter of who had been worse, while Sakura claimed that they had both been just as bad as each other, but neither had been as good as she had been. Kakashi had done a good job, Haruki thought reflectively as he nursed a cup of tea in his hands and watched the three kids bicker good-naturedly. If they kept moving forward like this, then they would be ready for the Chunin exams. XX. At the same time in the Hyuga compound, Neji was pacing his room, having been stuck between shock, anger, disbelief, happiness, and downright fear all day. When he had heard the first whisper that his father was alive, Neji had refused to believe it and had tracked down the Hyuga who had spoken of this and promptly sent him to the hospital. Strangely enough, he hadn't even been reprimanded. But the entire compound had soon started talking about his father, as if the man would come strolling back into their home any moment, so Neji, seething, had stalked back to his room and shut himself inside, ignoring the muffled voices outside. It hadn't been until a timid knock had sounded at his door that he had stirred from his meditation. He had said nothing, waiting for his cousin to get discouraged and leave. But the girl hadn't retreated, calling out in her usual stutter that his father was waiting for him in the meeting room. Enraged, Neji had all but ripped the door aside, startling Hinata enough that she stumbled back and fell, recoiling away from his anger. He had opened his mouth to shout at the girl, but a stern, painfully familiar voice stopped him before a single syllable could slip out of his mouth. Shaking, he had turned stiffly to the right, only to see two copies of his uncle. No, not a copy, because his father looked different from his uncle, even if they were twins, standing at the end of the hall. The one on the right had approached him, footsteps steady even as the man's Byakuyan eyes had shown a sense of wonder as they looked back at Neji, only the slightest undercurrent of hesitation swimming under the warmth of that gaze. Neji had unfrozen only enough to take an unsteady step back before tripping over thin air, falling to the ground with a thump and just catching himself with his elbows. He had remained still, a flush of embarrassment rising in his cheeks because this uncharacteristic clumsiness was not what he wanted his father, because this was his father. Damn it. He had known that the moment he had sensed the foreign but familiar chakra signal enter Konoha and seen his uncle rush out of the compound to see after 9 years apart. But Hazashi had just quickened his steps, dropping carelessly to his knees in front of Neji, and Neji remembered the biggest reason he had for loving his father. Hazashi, unlike his twin and most of the other adult Hyugas in the clan, never allowed etiquette or reputation to stop him from showing affection to his son and extending a tentative hand to help Neji sit up. Neji had stared at the hand without comprehension for a long moment, absently wondering if he had finally snapped and gone insane and this was all just a figment of his imagination. But if this was his imagination, then there was no way he would have embarrassed himself like this, which logically meant that this had to be real. So he had reached out slowly, his own hand hovering uncertainly over his father's as his gaze flickered up to meet Hazashi's gaze. For a moment, Neji had felt a brief flash of irrational fear at the thought that maybe this man would disappear again if he touched him and had made to retreat, but his father hadn't allowed it and had been quick to wrap a strong hand around his own, squeezing tightly for a fraction of a second before hauling him forward in one decisive pull and sending Neji tumbling forward. The moment Neji had collided against his father's chest, Hazashi's other arm had snaked around his back and Neji had found himself crushed against his father's body in a desperate hug that spoke of apologies and relief and love, and Neji hadn't even realized he had been crying until he had finally pulled back and found his father crying too. Minutes after that, Neji had been more than reluctant to let his father out of his sight, but Hazashi had assured him that he simply had to report to the Hokage and the council and that he would be back in a few hours, and then they would sit up all night catching up if Neji wanted to. Neji hadn't even remembered to feel embarrassed when he had immediately nodded in agreement. Now here he was, pacing the length of his bedroom while reciting ninjutsu theory, mentally going through all the different katas of the gentle fist, and ignoring the fact that he was keeping his Byakugan deactivated because he didn't think his heart could take it if he knew his father was coming. What if his father didn't like him? The last time Hazashi had seen Neji had been when he was a 4-year-old boy. What if his father was disappointed in the way he had grown up? If his father was disappointed in him, Neji would never forgive himself for the rest of his life. He didn't think he could stand. His head jerked up and he froze in the middle of his room when muffled footsteps approached his room, growing louder as each second passed. Neji swallowed convulsively and dimly knew he should probably sit down or straighten to attention and not remain standing like a fool and gaping like a fish in the middle of his bedroom. But before he could make up his mind, a quiet knock sounded at his door, echoing like a gong in his head as the telltale voice of his father called out, "Neji. May I come in?" It took Neji 3 tries before he managed to pull himself together and get his voice working. "Why yes. Please come in." He almost slapped himself when his words came out stiff and impassive as he had trained himself to speak. Kami-sama. His father was going to think Neji didn't want him here. The door slid open smoothly and Hazashi stepped inside, gaze instantly finding his son. He couldn't quite hide a frown as he watched him stand at attention, hands clasped behind his back and his face utterly blank. The Neji he remembered had been much more open. Granted, he had been a child, but surely Neji couldn't have changed so drastically. Hiyashi was in for one hell of a reprimand when he got some free time. With an inward sigh, he closed the door behind him and stepped further into the room, scanning the bedroom discreetly. There were no toys, no pictures, not even one of his genin team that Hazashi had heard about when Hiyashi had informed him of his son's rank on their way back to the compound. The room didn't seem to have much life in it and was as bland as one of the elders' rooms. He would have to work on that. He knew that the fire his son had always possessed was still in there somewhere. For now, Hazashi offered a small smile and glanced questioningly at the wooden seat tucked into Neji's desk. His son stiffened and Hazashi caught the faint flush that briefly stained his cheeks before the boy quickly moved to his desk and pulled out the chair, offering him the seat. After a moment of hesitation, Neji took a seat across from him, perching awkwardly at the end of his bed. Now then, Hazashi began, choosing his words carefully. There was one thing he wanted to say before they got into anything else. First of all, I would like to apologize for leaving you alone all those years ago. It must have been difficult to grow up without a father, and I am truly sorry for putting you through that. Neji had sprung to his feet by the end of his apology and the boy was already shaking his head. No, he denied. It was not your fault. Hiyashi-sama ordered it. Hazashi quickly held up a hand to quiet his son and, after a moment's contemplation, rose to his feet and shuffled Neji over before sitting down on the bed and pulling the boy down beside him. He could feel his son's tense frame and felt a stir of anger that Hiyashi would let Neji become so unused to affection. But again, that was a matter for another time. For now, Hazashi contented himself with holding the boy's hand in his own. Neji, Hazashi began again. How much did your uncle tell you about what happened 9 years ago? Neji frowned, shoulders relaxing ever so slightly as he adjusted to his father's presence. He did not tell me anything. He did not have to. Everyone in the clan knows what happened. When the elders talk about it, they discuss Hiyashi-sama's decision to perform the switch as a wise one. The bitter anger made Hazashi's eyes close and he mentally cursed the elders. They are wrong, Neji, he finally spoke, opening his eyes to look down at his son. Your uncle never made that decision. I did. And he proceeded to explain the events of the Hyuga affair, watching a desperate edge crack the wooden expression on Neji's face as he did so. That's not true. Neji tried to pull away but Hazashi only tightened his grip on his son's hand. Hiyashi-sama never said anything. Even when the elders praised him for it, he only nodded and said nothing to refute them. Hazashi scowled at this. That's stupid. He cut himself off when Neji flinched a little, and heaved a sigh instead. Your uncle is a very stubborn man, Neji, Hazashi finally said, turning to face his son again. When he makes up his mind on something, it would take quite a lot to change it. He decided a long time ago that my supposed death was his fault. By incurring your hatred, he believes he is atoning for his mistake. Hazashi fell silent and observed his son. Neji seemed a bit pale as he stared ahead sightlessly. The hold he had on Hazashi's hand was bordering on painful but he really couldn't care less. At least his son wasn't shying away from him. But then, Neji finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. The fate of those in the branch house is to sacrifice ourselves for the main house. Why would Hiyashi-sama not make that decision? Because he is my brother, Hazashi said simply. No matter how indifferent he may seem, Hiyashi does care. But he is clan head and sometimes, that burden is easier to bear if he pretends not to care. He paused, cocking his head in consideration. And who said that our fate is to sacrifice ourselves for the main house? I'm back, aren't I? And it was my choice to take my brother's place, not the other way around. Seeing the bewilderment in his son's eyes, Hazashi only smiled again. Trust me, Neji. I know your uncle better than anyone. I know what he is like. When Neji remained silent, Hazashi slowly released his hand and circled his arm around the boy's shoulders instead, ignoring the immediate stiffening in his posture. I am not asking you to change your mind about Hiyashi or the clan in general right away, Neji. Just give it some thought. He smiled inwardly when he felt Neji slowly relax before nodding in acknowledgement. Good. Hazashi turned a lighter smile on the boy beside him. Now let's talk about you. You are a genin now. Who is your sensei? Your teammates. Neji had automatically stiffened again at the questions and his hands twisted nervously together in his lap. Maeda Guy is my sensei. He paused and glanced up to gauge Hazashi's expression. Hazashi couldn't quite hide the twitch of one eye but cheered inside when Neji's mouth quirked up as well. Good. His son could still smile. This would be easier than he had first thought. Tenten and Rock Lee are my teammates. Rock Lee is the second coming of Guy Sensei. Neji had said this all with a deadpan expression, and Hazashi couldn't help the chuckles that slipped out of him. A second coming of Guy. Is he difficult to work with? Neji shook his head, his whole body finally having relaxed beside Hazashi. He challenges me to ridiculous contests every other hour and he is very loud. But he is a taijutsu specialist and he works hard. He works very hard and he is beginning to become a challenge against my gentle fist. Neji's voice had slowed near the end as if he had just realized something, but he continued before Hazashi could ask. And Tenten is a weapons specialist. She can wield any weapon you give her. Hazashi nodded thoughtfully. You have training tomorrow, do you not? At Neji's nod, Hazashi smiled and suggested, then perhaps I could come watch. I would like to see my son train with his team. Neji seemed torn between pride that his father wanted to watch him train and worry that he would disappoint him. Pride seemed to win out in the end as Neji nodded firmly. Practice is at 6 tomorrow, and Guy Sensei says we have a guest joining us. Akazama Haruki. He is. The boy trailed off when Hazashi stiffened in surprise. Otu-sama. Hazashi glanced absently down at him and shook his head. Not. Otu-sama. Neji. Otu-san. Is fine. That is what you have always called me. Neji seemed to hesitate before dipping his head in acquiescence and prompting, is something wrong, Otu-san? Hazashi hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. If you are training with Haruki-san tomorrow, Neji, pay attention to what he has to say and show you. He is an intelligent man and you could learn a lot from him. Neji blinked up at him. You know him. Hazashi inclined his head. I have met him. He is a good man. He glanced sidelong at his son but said nothing more. He wished he could tell Neji that it was Haruki who had brought him back, knew that that would most likely cement his son's loyalty to the redhead for the rest of eternity, but the secret had to be kept and he didn't think Haruki would appreciate it much either. Now tell me about your life, Hazashi encouraged. I have missed out on far too much. You must tell me everything. Hazashi considered the faint blush and pleased smile on his son's face a huge victory for the moment and settled down to listen to his son speak for the first time in 9 years. XX. Guy Sensei. If I cannot do 300 push-ups, I will do 600 sit-ups. I will be ready when the youthful Haruki-san arrives. That's the spirit, Lee. Do your best. Before anyone does their best, can we do introductions first? The light voice behind them made them both spin around, and Guy took a moment to wonder just how the red-haired Junin managed to hide his chakra signal so completely. Haruki-san. Lee had already jumped forward, bowing from the waist in greeting. Guy Sensei has told us of your youthfulness. I, Rock Lee, the valiant green beast of Konoha, am honored to make your acquaintance. Guy beamed proudly at his student's youthful greeting and cocked his head to observe Haruki. Most people seemed to find Lee's exuberance unnerving, but if he was right. Haruki chuckled and sketched a quick bow himself. It's an honor to meet you too, Lee-kun. The boy beamed and Guy chuckled. He absently wondered if Haruki could be unnerved by anything. Stepping up beside his student and flashing a grin at the redhead, the Junin did a quick scan of the other's face. Well, Haruki certainly looked better than he had yesterday. There were still bags under his eyes, but they were less pronounced and the man no longer looked like death had warmed over. You are quite early, Haruki-san. Guy said aloud. Lee has just finished his first set of warm-ups. Ah. The redhead reached up to rub the back of his head. I couldn't sleep and you did say I could come anytime between 5 and 6. It's around 5:10 right now, I think. Guy shook his head, hiding the brief concern that surfaced inside him. Haruki certainly looked like he could do with some sleep. We don't mind. Now that you're here, we might as well start. Turning to his student, Guy clapped a hand onto Lee's shoulder and smiled at him. Lee, stretch for a taijutsu spar. Lee straightened to attention. Hi, Guy Sensei. As he jogged off, Guy turned back to the waiting redhead. Can you spar with Lee? I'm not quite sure what you specialize in. If not, I can spar with him so you can assess him. Haruki only offered a slight smile as he shrugged off his coat and hung it on a nearby tree branch before tying up his hair. I specialize in ninjutsu and taijutsu, among other things. Just don't get me to teach anyone genjutsu. I'm terrible at those. Guy chuckled. You'll do fine then. Lee is training to become a master in taijutsu alone. Haruki nodded silently, eyes already taking in the smooth, sharp movements of Lee's katas. Already, he could see the powerful shinobi Lee would eventually become. He still had a long way to go, but the beginnings of his full potential could already be seen. A few minutes later, Haruki was standing opposite of Lee, with Guy stationed several feet away, glancing between the two before raising his hand. Taijutsu only. No weapons. Winner is called when one of you yields. Begin. Unlike Sasuke or Naruto, Lee stayed in one spot, body falling into his starting stance as he eyed Haruki carefully. The redhead nodded inwardly. A taijutsu specialist couldn't afford to charge right in when they knew their opponent was stronger than they were. It was better for the opponent to start. So, Haruki decided to start, pinpointing the holes he could already see in Lee's defense before dashing forward, letting his momentum help him spin on one heel and bringing up his other leg to lash out at the Genin's open side with vicious accuracy. Haruki had only dropped his speed enough to allow Lee to defend against him only when the boy was fully concentrating. Lee did not disappoint, his right arm dropping to block his leg and, instead of digging his heels in to hold his position against Haruki's obviously stronger kick, let the blow propel him away from Haruki's striking distance. The redhead allowed a satisfied smile flicker briefly across his face before following Lee, readying his next strikes as the boy stood his ground against him. Several feet away, Guy observed the blows being traded with great satisfaction and no little consternation. Lee was holding up well against Haruki, who had already gauged the boy's level and adjusted his own skill accordingly. But it was Haruki's style that troubled him. He wasn't both Lee and Neji's sensei for nothing. He could see their two styles mixed into the redhead's taijutsu. The gentle fist style could be explained away as Haruki having a friend in the Hyuga clan, but Lee's style was completely his, and some of the moves the redhead was pulling off, though watered down and probably unseen by those who didn't know what they were looking for, were moves that he hadn't even taught Lee yet. Who was this man? I thought we might find something interesting if we arrived early. Guy blinked and glanced behind him. He had sensed Neji approaching earlier with his father and he now smiled at both of them, gaze taking in Hyuga Hazashi. Hazashi-sama, it is wonderful to see you again. You have been missed. His gaze slid down to Neji, who, for the first time since Guy had laid eyes on him, looked completely at peace with himself. The boy was standing as close to his father as he could without seeming clingy, and there was a lightness about him that made Guy breathe an inward sigh of relief. It is good to be back, Guy. Hazashi placed a gentle hand on Neji's shoulder and the boy only stiffened for a second before relaxing again and glancing up at his father with a small smile tilting his lips. Guy could honestly say that it was the first smile he had ever seen Neji wear. Well, Haruki-san arrived earlier than expected, so I paired him against Lee. It's an interesting match. Guy kept a subtle eye on Hazashi and Neji as he turned back to the spar, noting the recognition that dawned first on Hazashi's face, and then his own students. Otu-san, Neji spoke up as his Byakugan activated. Haruki-san knows the gentle fist style. Hazashi remained neutral on the outside, studying the redhead carefully. He thought something like this might happen, which was partly why he had suggested coming early. His son would no doubt have questions. Perhaps he has seen Hyugas in battle, Hazashi replied out loud. It seems he has incorporated pieces of the Hyuga style into others. Neji nodded, mostly focused on the spar, but Guy caught the slight flicker in Hazashi's eyes and the vague way he had worded his answer. It seemed Hazashi knew more than he was letting on, but Guy couldn't sense any concern from the clan head's brother, so he pushed any remaining worries he had out of his mind. If such a high member of the Hyuga clan wasn't worried that someone outside the clan knew their fighting style, it was hardly Guy's place to make waves. But that still didn't account for the youthful style he could see in Haruki's taijutsu. Even in bits and pieces, slipped in when one least expected it, Guy could see that the other Junin knew his style, and knew it well. Guy-sensei. Neji interrupted his thoughts. Isn't that your style mixed in as well? Guy mentally winced at Neji's acute observations. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Hazashi stiffen and look over at him. The man's expression was as unreadable as ever, but Guy sensed that what he said next would be very important. In what way or to whom, he didn't know, but he was beginning to sense that there was something bigger in the process of being carried out right now. It seems Haruki-san is able to pick up different taijutsu styles quite quickly. Guy finally settled on a compromise. He hadn't lied. He could see at least half a dozen styles in Haruki's taijutsu, and even if the redhead had years to practice, it would take a high level of skill to incorporate it all together as flawlessly as Haruki had done. His answer was as vague as Hazashi's had been, but he liked Haruki. The man had never shown any discomfort towards him or Lee, and there was something about this whole situation that set off warning bells in his head and told him it would be best to get the full story before saying anything concrete to anyone. Beside him, Hazashi's shoulders relaxed again, and Guy knew he had said the right thing. For now, he would simply keep an eye on the red-haired Junin. It didn't hurt that he was a great sparring partner as well. Haruki was pushing Lee to his very limits. In the training grounds, Lee was astonished at the speed at which Haruki was delivering his strikes. Guy-sensei was still the epitome of cool, but Haruki here he had to completely stop thinking as he dodged and defended against a sudden flurry of punches and kicks, as if the redhead knew he wasn't completely concentrating, was somehow testing every single aspect of his training, forcing him to block properly and strike at just the right places, or his attacks would be met with an iron wall of defense instead of just a simple block. And slowly, as Lee got used to the speed, because this Junin was teaching him to settle into a faster-paced fight instead of slowing down for him, pushing him to stop thinking and simply go with his instincts, he realized that Haruki wasn't just sparring with him, he was fixing the spots Lee knew he was still prone to leaving open. Striking anywhere other than the center of the sternum and then the abdomen when executing a konoha senpu got him tossed back by a swift uppercut. And the simple rear spinning low kick when he tried the konoha reppu only got himself knocked off balance by the redhead if his leg was so much as an inch off from the best position. This form of teaching forced Lee to learn on the spot, to fix his mistakes after the first time around or risk getting dumped to the ground again. It was hard, and it forced him to concentrate solely on perfecting his entire fighting style, stance, alignment, offense and defense strength, and timing, instead of just parts of it as he usually did when he sparred against Neji or Tenten. It was hard, and Lee couldn't remember the last time he had had so much fun sparring against someone else. Haruki wasn't trying to defeat him, he was trying to teach him. Finally, as Lee lashed out with a roundabout high kick, Haruki simply ducked around him, one hand catching his wrist. Lee ruefully noted that his arm should have been tucked more closely to his side, and the other clapped onto his left shoulder, bringing him to the ground and expertly pinning his left arm behind him. For a long moment, all Lee could hear was his thundering heartbeat as he gasped for breath. The spar had finally come to a stop, and only now did he realize how fast he had been moving as his muscles felt like liquid fire as struggled to stay upright. A light chuckle came from behind him, and Lee found himself released and gently pushed into a sitting position. A bottle of water was suddenly produced, and Lee took it with a grateful smile. He was too tired to say anything out loud. Clapping reached his ears next, and Lee turned to see Guy-sensei approaching them, Neji and another Hyuga behind him. Lee blinked in surprise. He hadn't even sensed them in the clearing. Great job, Lee. Guy-sensei dropped into a crouch in front of him, clapped him firmly on the shoulder. I have never seen you move so fast or attack so accurately. Lee managed a grin as he rubbed an arm across his forehead. He looked up to see Haruki standing a few feet away, quiet as his gaze met Lee's. The Junin hadn't even broken a sweat. Lee forced himself back to his feet, wobbling a little but finding his balance before Guy-sensei could offer him a hand. He stood in front of Haruki and bowed deeply. Thank you very much for the spar, Haruki-san. When he straightened again, he made sure to stand tall despite his nearly shaking legs. Haruki observed him for a moment before nodding once and asking, "Did you learn anything?" Lee nodded immediately, breaking out into a determined grin. Yes, I did. Your training method is amazingly youthful. I promise I will fix everything you pointed out today before our next sparring match. If I cannot do so, I will run 100 laps around Konoha before practicing everything again. Haruki smiled faintly at him and nodded again. Good then. You're welcome. Lee beamed at the redhead before spinning around to face his sensei, only to lose his balance and tip backwards as his legs protested against the movement. Instead of meeting the ground though, Lee collided with a softer material and he glanced back to find Haruki standing behind him. He directed a sheepish look up at the Junin but Haruki only shrugged and steadied him again. Lee, was this spar helpful? Lee turned back to his sensei, grinning excitedly at him. Guy sensei was so cool. To invite someone like Haruki to practice with them was a stroke of genius. Hi, Guy sensei. Haruki-san improved my accuracy and speed and timing and. He trailed off as he realized the list was a bit long but Guy just laughed and nodded. Good. Starting tomorrow, you will go over what Haruki-san taught you today. For now, cool down and do your katas after you get your breath back. Lee nodded and then turned to Neji and the man standing beside him. Wait, wasn't that his uncle? Seeing his teammate's questioning look, Neji took a step forward and motioned to his father. Father, this is Rock Lee, one of my teammates. Lee, this is my father, Hyuga Hazashi. To his credit, Lee only looked mildly surprised before his face split into a wide grin again as he carefully moved forward. Neji couldn't believe that Lee, with his stamina, could be so completely exhausted after one spar with the Junin that even his father praised. As soon as he finished the introductions, he would ask for a spar of his own, and greeted his father youthfully. It is very nice to meet you, Hazashi-san. I am youthfully surprised by your unexpected presence today. Neji had to stop himself from face-palming. Why did his team have to be so damn weird? Luckily, his father didn't seem too perturbed and only inclined his head in greeting. It is nice to meet you too, Lee-kun. With the introductions over for now, all attention now turned back to Haruki, who had been standing off to the side, patiently silent as he observed their interactions. Hazashi hadn't missed the way that the Junin had seemed unable to tear his eyes away from his son, regret and sorrow mingling in darkened cerulean. If he had had any doubts about Haruki's origins before, they were all gone now. It seemed that his son and Uzumaki Naruto had been good friends in the redhead's timeline. He didn't want to know how his son had died to put that expression on Haruki's face though. Good morning, Haruki-san, Hazashi greeted instead, and watched as the redhead stirred, his usual impassivity surfacing again as Haruki looked at him. Good morning, Hazashi-san. This is your son then? Hazashi had to hide a wince when the redhead tried to smile at Neji but the action came out pained and even his son looked startled. Yes, this is Neji. Neji, I believe you have training now. Neji nodded briskly and stepped forward in the redhead's direction. He wasn't quite sure what to make of the odd expression Haruki had when the man looked at him but bowed respectfully anyway. Good morning, Haruki-san. I would like to ask for a spar as well. Your match with Lee was very interesting. Haruki nodded once. Warm up first. We can spar afterwards. Neji nodded and quickly moved away to begin his katas. If his spar would be anything like the one Lee had been put through, he would need to be in his best condition. As Neji started his warm-up, Hazashi remained beside Haruki as Guy and Lee drifted further away to discuss his training. Glancing sidelong at the redhead, Hazashi couldn't help asking, voice low so as not to attract the other's attention, you were good friends. Haruki flinched minutely, hands tucked in his flak jacket as he stared ahead, avoiding Hazashi's gaze. The best of friends, he finally revealed, just as softly. We knew each other since we were both genin. When the war started, we were assigned to the same Anbu team. Hazashi was captivated. Unlike last time, Haruki was actually revealing specific parts of his past. And though the Neji Haruki was talking about belonged to a different timeline, Hazashi still felt a glow of pride that his son would one day become Anbu. I was promoted after a while. Now that Haruki had started, it didn't seem like he could stop until he finished. Anbu captain. I picked Neji as my second on my squad. When I became general, I made Neji captain of his own squad and my second in command of the Anbu troops. He was silent for another long moment, and Hazashi waited patiently for the redhead to finish. And when I became Hokage, Neji became one of my Anbu generals. Anbu general. Hazashi watched his son go through a kata, smooth and well practiced. He had no doubt that Neji could become great, but it was a pleasure all the same to hear what his son had become in another time. One of your generals. Hazashi continued lightly. He wasn't surprised that Haruki really was a Kage. He talked to Sarutobi as an equal, after all. But a cage usually only assigned more than one general when there were too many men to lead. Haruki shrugged. A few of the other countries had fallen and requested to join us. We needed all the help we could get. So I assigned 2 people as my generals. Hazashi frowned. The other countries had fallen. If that was what would eventually happen, no wonder Haruki had traveled back in time. He didn't ask anything more though. The redhead seemed to have used up his sharing quota for the day and was already moving towards his son as Neji finished his last kata. Again, Guy started the spar and, like Lee, Neji held back and waited for Haruki to make the first move. Haruki closed his eyes briefly, firmly reminding himself that this was not his time's Neji, not as strong, not as knowledgeable of his movements, not him. And then he opened his eyes, and attacked. He knew the Hyuga style's strengths and weaknesses, knew them like he knew the back of his hand, having sparred with Neji even more than he had with Sasuke. So the standard gentle fist style, the one Neji had used before he had modified and improved it, was slow and predictable to Haruki, so much that he could predict each attack several seconds before Neji even started executing it. Haruki sighed inwardly as he easily fended off the blows. This wouldn't work. It was obvious that Neji was already quite good at the style and he had the skill to move on. He also knew that Neji had already learned, if not mastered, some of his clan's secret techniques and Haruki wouldn't force Neji to show them here. But perhaps, Haruki could get the boy started on his future style. Jumping back, he raised a hand to pause the spar, and Neji pulled up, a slight frown on his face. Neji-kun, I think you can see that I know how to counter the gentle fist style quite well already. Haruki paused and Neji nodded stiffly, obviously not knowing what to do about it. If you wish, I could teach you a more advanced style. The silence that descended on the training grounds was loud and tense as Neji looked stunned at Haruki's offer. He seemed to waver and then turned to look at his father. Haruki tilted his head as well, gauging Hazashi's reaction. The man was frowning, not with disapproval but concern. Are you quite certain, Haruki-san? Hazashi called out after a moment. Haruki heard the unspoken question. Can you afford to show your hand here? Haruki glanced at Guy and Lee. Neither said anything, observing silently at their exchange. But Haruki knew them. They understood that training secrets were not to be given out unless permitted to. They would not say anything about this to anyone. Hazashi already knew the truth, so. I am sure, Haruki replied as he turned back to Neji. Neji-kun, what I want to teach you is not a completely new style. More like your gentle fist style with more layers added to it. He paused, watching the genin. I would appreciate it though if you kept quiet about where you learned this. Neji stayed silent, weighing his options. To learn something new on top of his gentle fist would be very beneficial, and he was interested to see what someone who wasn't a Hyuga could teach him on said style. If the price was simply to keep his silence if questioned on this new style's origins, so be it. I would like to learn, Haruki-san. Neji straightened from his stance. And I will not say anything to anyone else about this. Haruki nodded, satisfied. This style would help, especially in the Chunin exams when Orochimaru attacked. Any extra strength Haruki could give them would keep them alive that much longer. Alright then, start in your usual stance. Haruki watched the genin settle into the stance, recalling the lessons his time's Neji had given him. When the Hyuga had started giving him lessons, Neji would attack in specific places and Haruki had gradually learned his friend's style by defending against those attacks. He had complained once that he had only been defending, and had asked Neji how he could learn a fighting style when he wasn't even fighting. Neji had laughed at him and invited him to attack in return, using the gentle fist style as a basis. Naruto had been astonished when his body had immediately followed the movements Neji had been drilling into him for weeks. Yes, he had been defending, but the way his muscles had moved when he had defended had automatically given him a powerful offense, hidden behind an iron wall of defense. So, defend yourself only while I attack, Haruki ordered, and then shot forward, pinpointing all the tenketsu points Neji had aimed at when the Hyuga had taught him. And so it went for the next half hour, with Haruki attacking in swift, precise movements, and Neji defending accordingly. On the sidelines, Hazashi hadn't been able to stop himself from activating his Byakugan and following the movements, his own arms twitching to learn as well. Though Neji was only defending, he could see a new style coming together. Where Neji was blocking with an open here and a forearm there, Hazashi could see the potential this defense could become when Neji reverted it into an offensive style. Hazashi's muscles hadn't weakened too much due to the life suspension seal, but he still needed to start training again. When Neji managed to pick up enough of this style to start practicing the offensive part on his own, he would ask his son to teach him as well. Or maybe he could just corner Haruki when the redhead had some free time and ask for training too. That could work. But what amazed him the most was the thought of where Haruki had learned this fighting style. He had obviously been taught by a Hyuga, which meant that someone had had to develop it in the first place. Haruki had seemed to imply that Neji was one of the few Hyugas he had associated with. Did that mean that his own son would eventually develop this style? And if he had, did that mean that Neji would be able to create something even more powerful if Haruki was teaching him this style now? Barely able to think, Neji was defending for all he was worth. Haruki's attacks were different, tugging Neji's arms and legs to positions that were similar to his usual fighting style but not exactly the same either. It was strange and he couldn't quite see how this would build up to better taijutsu. But he had caught a glimpse of his father's face when he had been forced to twist away from a sharp jab and follow through with a diagonal block of an open fist heading towards his side. His father had looked openly interested, Byakugan activated and never wavering from the battle. Hazashi must have picked up on something Neji had yet to see, enough so that it had drawn his complete attention. Either way, Neji was at least building up a very powerful defense. What's going on? Guy glanced back and offered a distracted grin to his final student jogging up to them. Tenten, Haruki-san came a bit early and we decided to start sparring. Start stretching while you watch. You're up next. Tenten was a little on the bewildered side at her sensei's abruptness but understood when she caught sight of the ongoing spar. Falling into her katas, she almost gaped at how fast the red-haired Junin had pushed Neji into moving. And was her teammate defending on purpose? There was a few times where he could have attacked, although Tenten had to admit that Haruki was leaving very little opportunities. 10 minutes later and the spar was over, Neji panting for breath as he leaned his weight on his knees. Haruki simply reached into his jacket and withdrew a scroll, unsealing a bottle of water for the Hyuga as well. Neji managed a nod of thanks and quickly downed a third of the bottle. A full workout was not what he had been expecting when he had woken up this morning and it wasn't even 7 yet. Neji-kun, keep practicing the movements you went through today. Treat them as katas even. Neji tried to settle his breathing as he straightened and nodded. His muscles remembered each move, even if his mind didn't. But he could see a pattern to the movements, a little strange, but now that he had the time to think instead of just react, he was also starting to have an inkling of what the Junin was trying to teach him. Thank you for the spar, Haruki-san. He sketched another bow and made a mental note to ask Guy after practice if it was possible to invite the Junin again next week. That way, Haruki could point out any flaws in his new training. Moving over to his father, he caught sight of Tenten and quickly introduced his father again. The words felt nice on his tongue. He had never been able to introduce anyone as his father before. Tenten also looked surprised but greeted Hazashi politely as she straightened from her katas. Neji knew that the Hokage was going to do a village-wide announcement of his father's return sometime soon, so there would no doubt be quite a number of shocked people if Hazashi decided to walk through Konoha. Soon, Tenten was standing in front of Haruki while the redhead studied her with a critical eye. She blinked and shifted a little nervously as she got into her taijutsu stance. Was there something wrong with her stance? She was quite good at taijutsu, but she preferred having some sort of weapon in hand whenever she fought. Wait, Tenten pulled up short as Haruki shook his head. Do you have a katana or a ninjutsu? Or even just a tanto? Tenten immediately brightened, nodding eagerly. Are we going to use weapons? Haruki inclined his head, turning to glance at Guy. Guy-san, I'd like to see Tenten's skill with a weapon, if that's alright. Guy was already nodding. Go ahead. Tenten is at her best when she is wielding a weapon. Tenten flushed a little but pulled out a scroll and unsealed a pair of tanto. Haruki nodded in approval and pulled out his own scroll, unsealing a beautifully made katana that Tenten instantly recognized. Hey, that's from my family's store. She stared wide-eyed at the Junin. My dad talked about you. He said you must be great at kenjutsu since you knew exactly what you were looking for. Haruki glanced down at the blade before nodding at her. My old one was destroyed. I had to get a new one and this was the closest I could find in Konoha. Now then, shall we? As metal clashed against metal, all those watching noted the difference immediately. Haruki was good, very good, when only using taijutsu, but he was great with a sword in hand. The Junin practically danced as he wielded the blade with the skill of a master, and even toned down, no one could deny the power accompanying every strike. Tenten found herself caught up in a whirlwind of blades as she defended rapidly against the red-haired Junin. She knew he was holding back and she could barely take the time to draw breath as Haruki bore down on her, as unrelenting as the steel he wielded. But once in a while, when she managed to strike back, Tenten caught a glimpse of bright cerulean and she knew that the gleam she saw in them matched the one in her own eyes. Unlike the taijutsu spars Haruki had had with Lee and Neji, Haruki was having much more fun now, even with a mere genin like herself. And this made her grin because she hadn't ever sparred with a kenjutsu master before. Sure, she knew there were Junin in the village who wielded swords, but it wasn't as if they were going to take the time to practice with her. Her eyes followed the katana that thrust at her ribs and she half jumped, half threw herself back, already panting but still grinning. Haruki-san, she called out. Those blades channel chakra. Aren't you going to use their full potential? She knew she was pushing it and if Haruki decided to humor her, his next attack would finish the spar. But she wanted at least a taste of what this man could do at the height of his power with a katana and if she could see that, then she wouldn't mind ending the spar prematurely. The redhead tilted his head, a few bangs brushing over one cheek before he smirked. Actually smirked. Tenten hadn't thought he ever would, what with the controlled smiles and neutral expressions Haruki usually wore. Alright. You asked for it. And with a flick of his wrist, chakra crackled down the blade in his right hand, curling around the katana like a snake. Tenten's eyes widened and she quickly raised her tanto again. It would do no good, she knew, but it would be better to at least try to defend herself. On the sidelines, the glow of white chakra had the audience backing up a few steps. Guy almost reeled as he finally got a taste of the other Junin's chakra. How had Haruki managed to hide so much power? Readying his katana, Haruki cut his thumb against the blade and let his blood mingle with his chakra. He didn't need seals for this attack. Raiden. Hu no Soshaku. Tenten remained frozen as lightning exploded around Haruki's katana, the head of a panther forming at the blade's tip and jaws made of pure lightning yawned open as the redhead flashed towards her at a terrifying speed. Before she could even think to move, the teeth of the panther had closed around her tanto and ripped them from her hands with as Haruki's katana came down, slashing downwards across both her weapons and leaving her empty-handed. Mere moments later, the glow of the lightning ebbed before disappearing altogether and she was left staring at Haruki standing calmly in front of her, katana lowered to his side and her two tanto scattered on the ground. She had no doubt that the redhead had pulled back the jutsu at the last second, preventing it from destroying her weapons. Silence settled over the training grounds but Tenten couldn't even consider speaking right now, too busy reviewing the Junin's attack in her mind. The lightning had been channeled into the katana in the form of a panther. The jutsu itself had been directed by the sword. Had Haruki's control of the chakra that had tempered the lightning been even slightly off, he would no doubt have lost control of his blade entirely. That was so amazing. Tenten bounded forward, glee lighting her eyes as she bent down to study the blade that Haruki still held. Without waiting for a reply, she whirled to face Guy, her excitement keeping her exhaustion at bay for the moment. Guy-sensei, did you see that? Why didn't you invite Haruki-san sooner? He's a kenjutsu master. I mean, did you see that? Guy's sweat dropped before shaking his head. He had no idea why Tenten would want to be a medic nin when it was so obvious that she was much more suited to become a weapons specialist instead. Still, the jutsu Haruki had just pulled off would amaze anyone. That was very cool, Haruki-san. Beside him, Lee sprang forward, all thoughts of rest gone. You must have a lightning affinity. Haruki blinked and moved to reseal his katana but sighed at the stars in Tenten's eyes and passed her the katana. She brightened even further, though Haruki had no idea why. The katana came from her family's store, after all. No, actually, Haruki replied, tugging the hair tie out of his hair and shaking it out. My affinity is wind, but I'm alright with lightning as well. Hazashi twitched from where he was standing. Alright. Haruki called that. Alright. Well then. Are there any other elements you are adequate with? Haruki blinked, eyes narrowing a little, and Hazashi was careful to keep his features blank. Water and fire, the redhead replied slowly. Some of my jutsus are based on those elements as well. Hazashi's eyes widened. Water and fire were complete opposites, as were wind and lightning. To have mastery over all four. Not earth then? He asked lightly. Haruki was quick to shake his head. I know a few simple ones that I learned as a genin, but that's it. I can't do many earth jutsus. Well, that came as some relief. Hazashi didn't anyone who could proficiently wield 4 elements, much less 5. Absently, he made the connection that Kazama Haruki was actually Uzumaki Naruto again. This man was the one Konoha had shunned and feared and hated. Some people were truly stupid. Haruki-san, when can you come back to join us for a sparring session again? Haruki took back the katana Tenten held out as she grabbed her tanto from the ground. He shrugged and glanced at Guy, who grinned back. Come back anytime, Haruki-san. So long as it's at least once a week. Haruki arched an eyebrow as he resealed his katana and unsealed a bottle of water for Tenten. I don't want to intrude on your own. Guy waved a dismissive hand in the air. Nonsense. You've been here for 2 hours and my students have already become more youthful. You must come back. Haruki blinked before glancing between the 3 students around him. Tenten and Lee were both nodding in agreement and Neji gazed back at him expectantly. You have only just started teaching me that new style, the Hyuga pointed out. I would not be able to advance if you do not make sure I am learning correctly. Haruki sighed and then nodded. I'll come back sometime next week. For now though, doesn't your team have to start actual training, Guy-san? 10 minutes later, Guy had his students running laps around the clearing while Haruki nursed his own bottle of water on the sidelines with Hazashi beside him. Thank you for teaching my son that style, Hazashi spoke up once Haruki had tucked away the bottle. Haruki shrugged. It belongs to him. If I didn't teach him, he'd develop it himself in a couple of years. But he needs it right then. He fell silent abruptly and Hazashi glanced over, a faint frown creasing his brow. Will something happen soon? Haruki was silent for a long moment, debating on how much to say. Everything will start during the Chunin exams. In my time, that's when everything began. Hazashi sorely wanted to ask but held his tongue. Haruki wasn't likely to say more on the subject. He trusted the redhead to tell him when he needed to know. For now, they watched Team Guy train, slower than usual as all 3 of them were still tired from the spars but still determined to do well. XX. Haruki stifled a yawn as he made his way to the Hokage Tower. He had forgotten what training with Guy was like. It was a wonder nobody died when subjected to his regimen. He glanced at the midday sun and sped up his pace. He wanted to tell the Sandaime about the Chunin exams before heading over to the Nara compound. As he walked past the Yamanaka flower shop, the redhead grimaced at the earlier conversation that surfaced in his mind. Shortly before Haruki had been able to make his escape from Team Guy's training session, Asuma of all people had accosted him with an easy smile and a determined glint in his eyes. The man had told him that he had seen the jutsu Haruki had used earlier when he had happened to pass by on his way to see the Hokage. Unfortunately for Haruki, this had piqued the usually laid-back shinobi's interest and the Junin had proceeded to ask the redhead to join his team for a training session tomorrow. Haruki had wanted to say no, but he hadn't been able to think of a good excuse and it didn't help that the last time he had seen Asuma, covered in blood and missing an arm while the man had clung to life to say a last farewell to Shikamaru, who had been rushing to the scene at the time, he had promised that he would look after his team. Of course, back then, he had been Anbu second and Asuma's old genin team had been one of the squads under his command. But later on, he had failed all 3 and they had died fighting on the battlefield. Haruki didn't think that Asuma meant for him to carry that promise all the way back in time, but he had failed once, he didn't want to fail again. So, he had agreed. Finally reaching the tower, Haruki shunshined up and through the Hokage's office window. It was so much easier than using the door. Inside, Sarutobi looked up in mild surprise from his paperwork before dismissing the Anbu in the room with a wave of his hand and activating the privacy seals. Good afternoon, Haruki-kun, Sarutobi greeted, pushing away his paperwork. Haruki offered a half smile and took a seat on one of the chairs in the room. I have to tell you about the Chunin exams. Ah. Sarutobi clasped his hands and his face turned somber. Very well. Quietly, Haruki recounted all that he could remember of the events of his first and only Chunin exams. Of Suna and Oto and Orochimaru, of Gaara and Sasuke and the Curse Seal, and of spies and the absence of Tsunade and Sarutobi's own death. The office was quiet when he finished, the silence neither tense nor horrified, just thoughtful as the Hokage digested this new information. We will need to bring Jiraiya and Tsunade back before the exams, Sarutobi finally said, voice grave. Haruki nodded in agreement. They would need all the help we can get. But getting Tsunade back will be very difficult. I will send word to Jiraiya and have him try to retrieve Suan, but if worst comes to worst, Haruki offered, I will go get her myself. Sarutobi studied him for a few seconds before giving him a small smile. I suppose if anyone would know how to change her mind, it would be you. What should I tell Jiraiya though? I expect you would want to tell him the truth yourself. Haruki nodded stiffly. I'd rather tell them both at the same time. If you could just tell him it's an emergency and that everything would be explained once he got back with her. He trailed off almost uncertainly and Sarutobi quickly nodded in acquiescence. That will be fine. I will send a message to Jiraiya. For now though, that is all I can do. I trust you will know the right time to deal with the spies and this Gaara. Haruki nodded. Leave all that to me. I will take care of them when the time comes. Sarutobi nodded in satisfaction before opening a drawer and withdrawing an envelope. All right then. Here is your pay for your recent mission. I will get started on researching this summoning jutsu Orochimaru has created. At the flash of worry in Haruki's eyes, Sarutobi smiled reassuringly. Do not worry, Haruki-kun. I will not die this time. I do wish to see Tsunade become Hokage. It would be an interesting change for this village. Haruki sighed but rose to his feet and left with a short bow. He only hoped Sarutobi knew what he was doing. Things would be moving fast before long and they would not be able to afford mistakes then. You're finally here, Haruki-san, Shikaku drawled, waving him inside when he caught sight of the redhead lingering at the gates. Waiting was getting troublesome. He glanced back in time to catch Haruki rolling his eyes and quickly hid a grin. He definitely liked this Junin more than the impassive one from yesterday. I already set up the board. Shikaku waved a hand at the shogi board set up on the wooden table and they both took a seat on either side of it. The Junin commander discreetly observed the way the redhead's eyes were already flickering from square to square, no doubt figuring out different starting moves. He scoffed inwardly. Not all that good his ass. You can start first, he offered aloud, watching that cerulean gaze flicker up to meet his. He had finally placed that color after thinking on it yesterday evening. Those eyes were the same as the Yondaime's, and there were gestures that the redhead made that reminded Shikaku of Minato as well. He had a few suspicions on what this meant, but he wasn't sure yet. The Junin commander watched as Haruki slid a pawn forward. A simple enough move and he moved one of his own in return. And so the game began. Shikaku had no time, nor did he have the desire, to make idle conversation as he frowned inwardly at the red-haired Junin's wild playing style. There wasn't much logic to each of Haruki's moves, as if he was simply picking a random piece up and moving it. But after the first time that Haruki had made a seemingly useless decision of sacrificing a lance and 8 moves down the road, Shikaku had found himself caught between losing a knight and losing a silver general. He had sacrificed his knight and never made the same mistake again. But still, there was something strange about Haruki's playing style. Shikaku had never played against anyone who could read his moves so far ahead and counter them accordingly. He had thought that maybe the redhead had picked up on a tell and had glanced up at Haruki several times, but each time, he had found the Junin staring avidly at the board, one arm balanced on a knee when he wasn't moving a piece, the other upright to cushion his head in one hand. Of course, Shikaku wasn't the Hokage's chief strategist for nothing, and, after studying the redhead's playing style for several minutes, he was able to counter some of Haruki's moves. And so they played for the next 4.5 hours, neither able to outmatch the other, but Shikaku had found a diamond-sharp mind behind Haruki's neutral facade, one that intrigued him all the more because every unpredictable move on the shogi board meant one more unpredictable thought. And if there was one thing Shikaku had learned since the beginning of the match, it was that Haruki had a very illogical mind. "You are very good," Shikaku finally spoke, breaking the silence for the first time since they had begun. Haruki's eyes flickered up to meet his. It was Shikaku's turn at the moment, and Haruki was forced to respond when the Junin commander made no move to continue. "I have not beaten you." Shikaku's mouth quirked up into a slight smile. "Most people wouldn't measure their skills in accordance to mine." Haruki managed a shrug without dislodging his head from his hand. "I am not most people." With that, Shikaku agreed wholeheartedly. And if Haruki was not most people, then perhaps he shouldn't ask his questions the way he would with them. Haruki had said he was straightforward. Shikaku preferred that as well. He left the twisting interrogations to Inoichi. Then, he finally moved his rook forward. "Who are you?" Haruki countered with a bishop. "I'm not quite sure what you mean." Shikaku arched an eyebrow. "All right, I'll be clearer. There are two things I want to know above all else right now. What relation do you have with Namikaze Minato, and what are you planning to do in Konoha?" He moved a pawn. To his credit, the redhead only tilted his head and moved a knight forward without looking away from Shikaku. "That's what you want to know above all else? Really?" Shikaku offered a lazy shrug. "I could ask you if you plan to harm Konoha, but that's somewhat pointless. I trust the Sandaime and he trusts you. Explicitly. I could also ask you how you managed to find Hazashi in the first place, but that's even more pointless. You're obviously partial to information I'm not, and I'm not interested in finding out something that's already over and done with. I could ask you how you managed to get from Konoha to Kumo and then back again while stopping multiple times on your way back in only 4 days when it would take an average ninja 6 days to make the entire round trip. But again, you must know some sort of jutsu I don't, and I'm not interested in that as I have no reason to go to Kumo anytime soon." And finally, Shikaku had now propped his elbows on the edge of the wooden table and propped his head on his clasped hands as he surveyed the motionless redhead with sharp eyes. "Finally, I could ask you why, when you entered the Nara compound," Shikaku slowly turned his head, gaze still fixed firmly on the Junin as he freed one hand to tug aside a curtain that had been half drawn over the window they had been sitting beside and revealed a seal, glowing a faint red on the glass. Haruki's entire face had frozen over, any remaining warmth disappearing as recognition flickered briefly through cerulean. "Did this chakra sensing seal, given to me by the Yondaime before the Kyuubi attack to pick up any demon chakra should it wander too close to my clan grounds, activate?" Shikaku watched Haruki closely for any reaction, but the redhead simply sat there, still sitting in the same position, eyes now focused on the seal. When it was clear that Haruki could not be speaking anytime soon, Shikaku sighed and rubbed at his goatee before reaching out and moving one of his gold generals. "I could ask you that," he continued casually. "But even though the seal picked up the demon chakra, I still can't sense anything from you. Your control over whatever chakra you have inside you is good enough. As long as you're not about to go insane and destroy the village, it's none of my concern. Your move." Haruki remained still for a few seconds longer, gaze still fixed on the seal before turning back and extending one hand, moving a pawn forward. Half a dozen plays that Haruki could make with that move sprang up in Shikaku's mind, but he dismissed them. He could stop each of them if he took the pawn now. Moving his knight, he secured the pawn. "It's not finished." Haruki's quiet voice accompanied his next move as he shifted a lance. Shikaku frowned. "What isn't?" Haruki flicked a finger at the seal. "That seal. The center is not finished. At the moment, it can only detect the Kyuubi's chakra." Shikaku immediately stiffened, eyes narrowing as he realized what the redhead had just told him. "But how? The Kyuubi Jinchuriki was Uzumaki Naruto. Who are you then? He asked again, moving his rook to the left. You look like the Yondaime. I can almost see it. Change your hair and you'd be an almost exact copy. Long lost brother. Cousin. Haruki gave a half shrug as he moved his lance again. Shikaku scanned the board before moving a silver general and capturing another of Haruki's pawns. Maybe I just look like him. Haruki tapped a finger on the edge of the wooden table before shifting a gold general. Shikaku immediately took the knight that Haruki had failed to move with one of his gold generals. It seemed like the game was coming to an end. Haruki wasn't concentrating anymore. I highly doubt that, but we'll leave it for now. Shikaku observed the redhead for a moment. So what are you doing in Konoha? You're definitely not one of my Junin. I was Junin commander 8 years ago. I would have remembered sending out any of my Junin. Even if the Hokage didn't inform of it, I would have at least noticed you missing. Haruki finally straightened from his lazy slouch, meeting Shikaku's gaze evenly. Protect Konoha. That's what I've always tried to do. Shikaku frowned. The devotion that now shone in Haruki's eyes was startling. What attachment did he have to this village to show that much dedication to it? The sound of a door sliding open and closed signaled his son's arrival. I'm home. Shikaku quickly pulled the curtain back and turned to face Shikamaru as the boy stepped into the room. Welcome back. How was training? Out of the corner of his eye, he caught the oddly wistful expression flickering briefly across his temporary shogi partner's face as his focus turned to his son. Strange. Troublesome. Shikamaru had paused to take in Haruki and then the shogi board. Are you the one training with us tomorrow? Asuma sensei described you. Shikaku blinked in surprise before turning to look at Haruki. The redhead seemed to struggle with himself before producing a strained smile in his son's direction. Yes, he invited me to train with his team tomorrow. Shikamaru nodded briefly, stepping forward as he glanced at the shogi board again. I'm Shikamaru. You'll probably find training with us troublesome. Haruki only shrugged before rising to his feet. Perhaps. We'll see. He turned back to Shikaku and nodded at the board. I believe this game goes to you, Shikaku-san. It was an interesting match, but I'd better be going. Thank you for having me. I'll see myself out. With a low murmur of, see you tomorrow, Shikamaru-kun, the Junin swiftly departed the Nara household, disappearing from sight without another glance at either of them. Shikaku remained in the same position for several seconds after the redhead's abrupt departure. He only stirred when his son dropped down in Haruki's vacated seat, waving a hand at the board to get Shikaku's attention. You were playing. Shikaku heed an affirmation. 5 hours. He's good. Shikamaru nodded distractedly, eyes on the board. When he left, why did he say that the game went to you? Shikaku arched an eyebrow and glanced down at the board as well, reaching out to tap one of his silver generals. I would have checkmated him in 3 moves. He was distracted near the end. Shikamaru frowned and scratched his head. Yeah, but if he moved this, his son tapped a simple rook sitting innocently near the left side of the board. He would have checkmated you in the next move. Shikaku sat in frozen silence, eyes glued on the pawn as he reviewed all the moves that had been made in the last 6 minutes and all the possible moves he could have taken or not taken. The 2 pawns and the knight. They had been distractions, mere diversions to draw the gold and silver generals that had been guarding his king away from their positions and remove the knight that had been blocking the rook's forward movement that now trapped his king. If he moved any piece to stop the rook now, he would leave the redhead's lance or gold general free to attack his king. Those 2 pieces, he realized, were the very ones that the redhead had seemingly carelessly moved last, and the 2 pieces that stopped them at the moment were the 2 generals he had moved to capture Haruki's sacrificial pieces. Instead of capturing the pieces in his way, Haruki had simply moved them elsewhere. Instead of going to the effort of cornering his king, he had let Shikaku do it for him. And like any fresh amateur, he had fallen for it, so preoccupied with his questions and Haruki's answers that he hadn't seen it. And the runt had forfeited and given him the win. That damn. He cursed long and hard inside his head when he remembered that his son was still in the room. How dare he? He couldn't remember the last time he had lost a game. And with that thought came a rush of respect as he allowed his short-lived annoyance to leave him in a rueful laugh. Haruki was an excellent shogi player. Even if he had lost, the redhead had still matched him move for 5 hours. The strongest player Shikaku had played before Haruki had come along had only lasted 3.5. Shikamaru. He barked out sharply as he suddenly straightened. Shikamaru pulled back, looking mildly alarmed. What? You have training with Haruki-san tomorrow. At his son's wary nod, Shikaku continued, a foreboding glint in his eyes. Don't let him get away afterwards. Drag him back here if you have to. I want a rematch. But his son only scoffed and rose to his feet, stretching and making his way out of the room again, no doubt to go cloud watching. As he left, Shikamaru only tossed back, old man, if he can beat you, then the only one Haruki-san will be playing tomorrow will be me. I've never met anyone who could trump you in a shogi match before. Besides, dragging him all the way back here will be too troublesome. Shikaku twitched as he watched his son leave the room. Damn brat, he growled, glaring at the board. And then he leaned back and smirked, turning to glance at the curtain now covering only blank glass once more. He had learned some things today, some from his own observations, others that Haruki had willing imparted to him. He would have to think on it some more, and in the meantime, he would need to come up with a way to convince Haruki to come back for another round of shogi. That's it for this part. If you enjoyed it, then like, share and subscribe for the next video as it's going to be more interesting, and also check out my other playlists. Hope you would like them too.